All right, there we go, 9 a.m. on the dot, at least here in Eastern UTC -5. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good generic time of the day, wherever you are in the world. Really appreciate y'all joining. I'm Eugene Leventhal. I'll be doing the kickoff for the grant summit that we're kicking off. It's going to be today and tomorrow. We have about 4 hours each day, 3.5 to 4 hours each day of a bunch of wonderful speakers, some fireside chats, and a panel. So really excited for all the programming that we're going to be getting into. I'm going to start off with a very brief introduction of myself, of the Grant Innovation Lab, a little bit about Metagov overall, and then we will be getting started with the first actual presentation, which is actually, or excuse me, the first fireside chat 10 minutes after the hour. So just to do a quick introduction on myself. So my name is Eugene Leventhal. I am currently the head of governance at the Scroll Foundation, which is a layer 2 in the Ethereum ecosystem. I'm also a research director at Metagov, where I am part of the Grant Innovation Lab and helped kickstart that a couple of years back, and have been working with a bunch of wonderful humans who I will be highlighting shortly. On myself, I've been in and around Web3 full-time for the last 4.5, 5 years. And a lot of that focus has really much been on granting and on governance. And, it's been really exciting getting to go from the initial idea and kind of pitching the idea of the State of Web3 Grants report a couple of years back to seeing all the various work that has emerged. And you can see kind of my background has spanned the corporate world. I've also had some experience with nonprofits. I tried starting a Web3 nonprofit project back in 2016-17, which was an interesting time to do so. And I'm happy to chat about it in other spaces. But yeah, have also worked in academia as well as in startups. So I've seen kind of funding in a few different domains. And about the Grant Innovation Lab, if you're checking this out, this QR code will take you to grant.metagov.org, where you can get links to all of the things that are posted here and written about. And that's the best place to kind of see all of our outputs and learn more about what we do at the Grant Innovation Lab. We're a group of, it's a variable number. We're a decentralized kind of research collective within Metagov, which itself is a pretty decentralized org and focuses on governance more broadly. But for the Grant Innovation Lab specifically, our origin really started with the State of Web3 Grants report in 2023. And the whole idea was, we were just seeing that there was this gap in kind of systematic writing about different grant programs, and at least starting to do qualitative analyses and understanding what are the different approaches that are being taken towards granting in the Web3 space specifically. And I got connected with Michal a bit over 2 years ago, or going on 2.5 years ago. And we kind of brainstormed this idea of, what the State of Web3 grants could look like. What are the first kind of dozen or so ecosystems we could cover? And to my very pleasant surprise, doing a one-time report turned into this whole little research group and producing now, State of Web3 grants in 2023, in 2024, having a 3 retroactive case study paper where we looked at optimism at DAO drops and at the Gitcoin Citizens rounds, and kind of comparing those 3. And this was a bit over a year ago. And also work on the Grant Maturity Index, which is led by Ben and Feems, who will be both presenting and sharing throughout the next couple of days as well. So yeah, it's definitely been a very exciting journey to see these different papers and the interest from the space in terms of having these kind of conversations. And, we've also, this is not our first event, this is our first virtual event. And we're very much interested in also hearing from folks after this and getting any kind of, constructive feedback and just ideas on how we can improve, because we see a need both for operators to learn from each other, from grantees to better understand how to more effectively apply for grants, how to, more effectively state their needs and make it known to the operators so that the operators can actually help projects flourish in their ecosystems, and create these kind of feedback loops between, operators on the one hand and grantees on the other. So we're very interested as this sort of, nonprofit group in seeing the role that we could play in facilitating these conversations. And so we're very much appreciative for all the folks who are joining, whether for the entire 2 days right now or just dropping in for a presentation here or there. Just really exciting to see the interest. And I know we got so many speaker applications. Unfortunately, we couldn't accommodate everyone. And so we're definitely very interested in making sure there's more opportunities to have these kind of conversations. And, I do want to just take a moment to thank everyone. I'm assuming at this point there's just like clapping and riotous, just, yeah, woo, just like pure cheering from everyone watching. Because with every event, there's just so much background work that, doesn't get any visibility. And so I just wanted to take a moment to thank all of the event organizers with a special thanks to Josh Young, who is interning with us for the summer and who really took on a lot of the grunt work of making this event a reality. Themes and Anke, Ben, Michelle, Mike, Rashmi, Sam, everyone has kind of played their own role and been able to help make these 2 days what they are. So I'm personally very thankful to all of you and to everyone who is interested in both making this event possible and more broadly kind of sharing these conversations so we could really refine what we mean when we say grants, and as a result get better at clearly kind of getting to the point of stating the desired outcomes, the change we want to see in the world, and how we best measure that kind of change. And so for a quick plug on Metagov as well, Metagov is a governance research nonprofit. This QR code will take you to our really cool website. We have this kind of catchphrase that it's a laboratory for digital governance. And so the kind of folks who are at Metagov really cover a wide variety of topics. And I'll share a quick snapshot of the team in a moment. But if you do go to the website, you'll see there's these weekly seminars that you could sign up for that. There's a community Slack with over 1,500 members at this point. So if you are interested in a broad decentralized governance community, I'm obviously biased, but I would highly suggest checking out Metagov. The research directors and some of the team really vary, both in terms of Web3 folks, but you'll see a bunch of names on this list of folks who are not exclusive to Web3 by any means. And so Metagov itself is this organization that broadly looks at decentralized governance. And it was founded by academics, with Josh Tan kind of really kicking everything off a couple years back, and amassed this wonderful group of researchers who are there. And so Metagov continues to expand to cover, whether it's governance in Web3, governance in AI, governing commons, both digital and physical, just looking at really any digital governance questions. And so again, if you're interested, if you're excited by any of those elements, please feel free to jump into the community, say hello, see what else is going on there, and explore potential ways to collaborate and get involved. So finally, I just wanted to quickly touch on what is to come today. There is a bunch of great programming to start off. Next up, I will be facilitating a fireside chat with Alex from ARIA, and we're going to talk about a little bit about their work in the UK and frame a little bit of discussion on mechanism design and talking about the future, or just thinking about different experiments to run and what we can look forward to in the next, let's say 6 to 12 months. We're also going to hear from Anke from Stellar on designing grants that grow your ecosystem. Fede from EF will present a bit on EF's grants. Themes is going to be talking about strategy and funding with capital design and some of the exciting research they've been working on. We're going to hear from Robbie from Endowment on this passive quadratic funding idea to decentralize philanthropy. Michelle will be talking a bit about the Octant Accelerator. We'll hear from Joel Miller talking about fair collective decision-making through plurality, and always exciting to see more plurality-oriented topics. We're going to have Vaughn have a discussion around grants versus markets and kind of approach a fireside chat around the case study. We're going to have JB Rubinowitz talking about AI do's and don'ts, because AI is obviously all the buzz these days. And then we'll have a fireside chat between Kush and Themes to round out the day to talk about funding in LATAM. And last but certainly not least, because I realized I forgot to set it earlier, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Michelle, Sarah, and the Octant team overall. They have been tremendous in both helping organize and making all the visuals beautiful and helping us with all the logistics technically. So just a tremendous thank you again to everyone involved. So that is really it. We hope that folks get these different takeaways from the day. We'll get to learn around different trends, and we'll get to hear about the various exciting topics to folks. So thank you for the time with the kickoff. And yeah, would love to have Alex join shortly so we could get the fireside kicked off. There we go.
Hey.
Welcome, Alex. How are you doing today?
Great. How are you? Can you hear me well?
Yes, coming through loud and clear.
Amazing. I'm great. Thanks for the invite and the great presentation before.
Oh, yeah, I appreciate you joining. And I guess to get started, do you mind just giving a quick introduction on yourself?
Sure. I'm currently a program director at ARIA, the Advanced Research and Invention Agency. It's an R&D funding body in the UK, similar to DARPA for people that may be familiar with DARPA watching. So we're funding moonshot R&D projects that are usually differentiated and that no one else is funding to try to nurture and catalyze research that can be 0 to 1 instead of incremental, and that can be bets that aren't necessarily being taken right now. Before that, I was very much in crypto, and I co-founded a company called Flashbots. We were doing also a lot of R&D and giving grants as well, and before that, other things in crypto.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I mean, this journey of kind of being in crypto to an agency like ARIA is by no means a standard one. Do you mind sharing a little bit of kind of how you went from, founding a project in the Web3 space to getting involved in an agency like ARIA?
Yeah. In the case of Flashbots, I think we started very much as an R&D organization, and we thought a lot about funding research and also about sustainable funding mechanisms for research. One of the ideas we had early on was, could some MEV, for people familiar with MEV, could some value that's created from the products we're releasing somehow be directed to funding research? And over time, we studied a lot of the R&D organizations throughout history, like Bell Labs and these models, and kind of trying to understand, can we learn from this and can we create some of that in our own company culture? And so naturally, I was very interested in the R&D landscape and what's going on there, and things like focused research organizations with convergent research and different philanthropic efforts outside of FROs. And so when ARIA popped up, I was kind of aware of it, aware of the model, aware of what they were trying to do, which I found very interesting. And so after Flashbots, I was interested in going that R&D path even further. And part of what I was doing as Flashbots was thinking about organizationally and structurally, how do we fund research, both internally for how do we organize, but also externally. So we have a grant program, but also different mechanisms that we can do, et cetera, et cetera. And so that naturally led me to looking at ARIA, and then a few friends recommended I work with them. And so I went through the formal process of being a program director.
That's really cool. And can you give a sense, especially for those who don't know ARIA and, might have only heard DARPA vaguely and so only have like a vague sense of you do big things, but it's not always clear what they do. Can you give a sense for folks of what are the kind of domains that ARIA funds in, or some of the current funding priorities?
Yeah, I can also maybe give a slight sense of structuring as well. Maybe that would be helpful in the context of such an event.
That'd be great.
So the DARPA model that ARIA has adopted as well is one that started from an assumption that to fund really breakthrough research, sometimes funding by committee is not an ideal funding mechanism. And so instead, picking specific individuals that are going to lay out their thesis and a vision and giving them relatively less amount than large funding kind of calls that one can do, but giving them kind of free rein to deploy funding in what can be like a very crazy bet, let's say. And so these characters are called program managers at DARPA and program directors at ARIA. Each of them has their own kind of pod, let's say, and you deploy funding within this pod within a portfolio of R&D projects. ARIA is location agnostic, entity agnostic as well, so it deploys funding into whatever types of projects. That can be academic groups, that can be companies, that can be an academic that is spinning out into a company, that can be a nonprofit, doesn't matter. And they can be anywhere else in the world, anywhere in the world.
So it's not just in the UK, it's by priority area?
Yes, it's not just in the UK, but this is UK taxpayer funding, and so it has to make sense for the people in the UK, of course. And our responsibility is with the UK taxpayer, but the innovation we're targeting and the breakthroughs we're targeting are ones that would change the world. And so for many of these things, you have to fund globally in order to have an impact on the UK as well. And so naturally, we look at beyond the UK as well. And the mandate of ARIA currently touches everything but defense, so that's a major difference with DARPA. And so currently we have 8 programs already running and another 8 that are currently in incubation stage, let's say. I'm one of the incubated stage at the moment. In the first stage, we have neural interfaces, stuff related to geoengineering, stuff related to synthetic plants and programmable plants, stuff related to dexterity of robots and making robots more kind of more dexterous, I guess. I'm repeating myself. Safety and AI. Alternative computing paradigms, and looking at nature as a computing substrate and different kind of ways you can use nature there. And in the second cohort, so my cohort, there's people looking at materials abundance and looking at materials R&D and doing new stuff there. People looking at mitochondrial engineering and whether we can harness energy within biology the same way we've learned to use information in a way to solve diseases like Alzheimer's, etc. For me specifically, for our pod, our program and our opportunity space, we are looking at embedding cryptography in nature and looking at whether we can have formal security guarantees that extend beyond the digital world for cyber-physical systems, which is a little broad, but I hope that still gives a bit more color to the audience for what ARIA does and what I'm doing specifically within this. Maybe one thing that's worth mentioning is the amounts that are deployed. Maybe people are wondering. I don't know if there's questions or
well, we'll keep track and do comment on Twitter. We are keeping an eye on that, and we will be bringing up Q&A towards the end of the time together. So yeah, for anyone listening, if you do have questions for Alex, please feel free to start commenting on the stream, and I'll keep track of those. But yeah, it would be great to get a sense of funding sizes.
Yeah, so it's per program, it's 50 to 100 million pounds, so about 60 to 120 million dollars. The total funding size of ARIA, I think, is like 2 to 3 billion right now, and so it's deploying that over programs. It has the ability to double down. You have the ability to do multiple programs, and it's still figuring itself out. So what's exciting about ARIA and why I'm excited to be here, partially, is that ARIA is a new organization. It's a few years old, and while it's inspired from past organizations, it's trying to do things differently, and it's also very flexible with the way it's doing things because processes haven't been ossified yet, and there's a strong hunger for how can we innovate on what has happened in the past. That includes how to innovate on funding mechanisms as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot there that's cool for people that are listening as well, for maybe potential collaborations with ARIA or ways that people in the audience can contribute.
For sure. Yeah. I always can't help whenever I get a chance to catch up with, yourself or someone working in these environments. It always just feels as though, wow, I'm talking to someone who's just funding, science fiction in the future, in that sense of, so many of these topics sound really out there, but then when you actually get into it, it's so fascinating to see the evolutions that they can bring. And especially for anyone here who isn't as familiar with the history of these kind of systematic programs or anything, you could check out, and I'll make sure to comment later when I'm not hosting, a link to a few reading materials, such as, Reinventing Discovery by Michael Nielsen, or what was the Bell Labs book? I think was the Idea Factory. Yeah, then Mitchell Wardrop's The Dream Machine, which is a biography of J.C.R. Licklider, who was one of the key instrumental figures in ARPANET and, the future internet and a lot of the early DARPA days. So yeah, I'll share some of these links. And I know you mentioned FROs and Anna Marblestone's work there. And I know Ben Reinhardt and his PARPA writing, which became Neuraltech. I'm forgetting his new org, but I will link to all these things later. But it's such
SpecTech.
SpecTech, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's such an exciting landscape of different players and organizations. And so I guess, to come back to this idea of mechanism design and funding specifically, so there's ARIA overall, which has its broad budget that it gets, which is in the, few billion. And then that gets split up amongst program managers who are kind of get to oversee concrete programs in a specific area. So, you listed many before. And then within each program, what kind of mechanisms does a group like ARIA use? Is it mostly prospective research funding in the sense of, hey, Alex, you're doing fascinating research on, a natural embedding of cryptography into natural systems. Here's a grant to go do a thing, and we track your milestones. Is it kind of exclusively in that range, or are there other mechanisms already being used?
So what's cool is that we have full freedom over how we deploy the capital. And so some mechanisms have been used so far, but they're not the full range of mechanisms we can use. So we can always invent new ones. A lot of it right now has been through grants, non-dilutive grants to companies or to academic groups. The way this works is you do a solicitation first. So you do a call for, here's our thesis, here's what we believe the world could be, or here's like a technical breakthrough that we think could happen. We don't really know how to get there, and then apply for funding essentially, and then you get maybe 200 300 applications, maybe more, and then you review those and you build a portfolio out of that. Now there is appetite to do competitions, to do prizes, and there's appetite to do some stuff that's fancier as well. I think we're still figuring that out, if that makes sense. For us specifically, I want us to kind of experiment a lot with new funding mechanisms. I'm excited about competitions. It's not new, but I'm excited about competitions as an alternative to grant funding, partially because the incentives are more aligned in a competition in my mind, and the overhead on verification is lower as well, or it's a little different. And there's
and when you say
trade-offs, of course.
competition, sorry to interrupt, are you alluding to X Prize style things along those lines, or do you have a different kind of model in mind there?
I think there's a few that I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of the DARPA Grand Challenge, for example, the self-driving cars, through the desert. I'm thinking of something like ImageNet as the substrate for the kind of the renaissance of, well, not the renaissance, but the age we're currently in of neural networks. And so the competition there, or CASP for AlphaFold as well, as having the kind of the structure for that to exist. But even something like the Vesuvius Challenge by Nat Friedman, which I'm sure you've seen, to try to read ancient Roman scrolls, using AI and putting a prize on that. Competitions are much more mimetic, in my opinion, and competitions can also attract people that don't need funding, which to some extent, sometimes some of the best people can find funding. Either they're hustlers, or either they're already really doing well. But if you want to attract this talent, there needs to be a good story or something that's really compelling. And so, yeah, some of these competitions I find very interesting. And then beyond this, Eugene, we talked briefly before, there's mechanisms in the crypto space that I think can be very interesting. And to some extent, the game theory of multiple people sharing money together and having to negotiate with each other about who's going to use how much capital, mechanisms for incentivizing cross-disciplinary reviewers for fields that maybe don't exist yet. So if you want to spawn a new field, you also need to think about the verification of claims that are made in this field. And so incentivizing that side of the quote-unquote market is interesting as well. And then, honestly, there's something with tokens that I would like to look into more, just because tokens are, to some extent, incentivization tool that can be used. And the space of funding mechanisms and tokens, a lot of it, there's fluff and there's noise, of course, but some of it, I think, deserves further exploration. So I would love to experiment with that as well, without any concrete plan right now on how to do so, but at least bearing in mind that there's interesting things there. And then I'm trying to follow a little bit what's going on in the space, and the Web3 space, because I think there's a lot of innovation there when it comes to funding mechanisms. Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, it sounds like there also might be opportunity for a challenge to come up with mechanisms that specifically maximize kind of long-term alignment between participants and whatever the challenge is. Because I know, there's projects like Hypercerts and others that focus on, hey, something in the research category, especially, we're not going to know in 6 to 12 months if the results are meaningful or not. It might take 5, 10, 30, 40 years. And, looking at the world of AI as a specific example where, the Dartmouth conference was in the 54, 55-ish, somewhere around there. And ImageNet was in the late 2000s, and then ChatGPT was 2022, 2023 when 3 came out. So seeing these kind of timelines of evolution, I guess whether it's in the temporality of it or in any other dimension, I guess, do you see any particular problems with the current types of funding where there might be that incentive misalignment, where there might be other challenges that you're seeing, where we can, try to call out of, hey, if you're designing mechanisms, think towards, X problem or this kind of challenge, to just help some of the folks who are listening here maybe frame and try to come up with some potential solutions?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at grants, for example, as a funding mechanism, they're great in some ways, but the incentive is not always aligned because people tend to apply for grants that might be they want funding for something else, but they need to comply to what the grant is asking for. And so it's not necessarily that they might spend 80% of their time on the grant work and 20% of their time on something else, which is maybe fine, but at least there's like incentive alignment there that may be different. Yeah. Also, the mechanism by which the grant is enforced is fear. It's like, well, the funding might be cut or you might not get follow-on funding. And so the motivation is a little bit by fear, again, in some models, which is not necessarily conducive to creativity or to really risk taking. Yeah. And for the reviewer, I think there's a burden in verification as well, that you have to go through the work that the person has produced or the group has produced, and verification can sometimes be very lengthy. And sometimes take as much time. I mean, to some extreme, it might be, if it's very niche work, you might need other experts to review the work, and then you need to give grants to the other experts to review the work. And so it feels a little bit incentive misaligned. It feels a little bit, the incentives might not be the most mentally motivating ones. And it feels that the burden of verification means it's very hard to keep track of a large portfolio of grants, for example, in a very meaningful way, or to manage it actively, which is something that ARIA does, where we give grants, but you're able to take back some of the funding depending on whether some milestones are hit and things like this. So solving some of these problems would be great. Competitions solve some of these problems at the expense of other things. But there's a lot more there to potentially look at. I also think some funding mechanisms can be application specific, or can be specific to the research problem that's studied. If we're trying to go after building some kind of public good that's open source, and we require collaboration between parties that wouldn't collaborate otherwise, there are funding mechanisms there to kind of incentivize this that wouldn't necessarily work for another deliverable or another output. Yeah, and I don't have a ton of like problems where I'm like, we need mechanisms for this. I think what I'm interested in, and what I think we're interested in at ARIA, but also some of these funding groups that we're now more in touch with. We mentioned Convergent, there's Renaissance Philanthropy, there's all these people that are very interested in funding R&D and that are actively doing so. I think there is a strong hunger and excitement for new funding mechanisms, and there's like curiosity for like what's out there, what are people thinking about, what is new and different that we can try out at a small scale, or what can fund different pockets of the market that maybe are not funded right now, or that enable different kinds of entities. One that we didn't mention so far, but that's someone worth reading about is Eric Gilliam. He has this blog called Freak Takes, and he talks about a new type of R&D organization that is funded through contract work, and maybe there's new funding products just for these type of organizations to exist. And he compares it to, in the old days, how new loans allowed some new industries to exist as well, and maybe there's something like this. So anyway, application specific, I don't have a ton of problems that I can just give you a list of problems and then people listening can just go figure out mechanisms. But I am very interested in whatever mechanisms people are thinking about, and very interested in experimenting with them as well.
Yeah. Well, Alex, we really appreciate you joining today. Unfortunately, no external questions came in, so I took the privilege of getting to ask them all myself. But yeah, really appreciate you kicking us off. And I know we have closing in on 600 folks watching. So really appreciate you kind of setting this tone of interest in these new mechanisms. And we'll be switching over shortly to the next discussion with Anke. And yeah, I'll make sure to get some links from yourself, Alex, that we can share publicly with the audience, because I see that question just came in. And yeah, Metagov is going to be working on some convenings with different funders and funding agencies, both in the development and research space, probably early to mid next year. So we'll definitely keep you posted on that side as well. But yeah, thank you so much for joining, Alex.
Thanks for having me. It was great to be here. And if anyone that's listening wants to reach out to me on Twitter, you're more than welcome to.
Amazing. Thank you. Well, with that, yeah, we have Anke Liu joining from the Stellar Development Fund. And yeah, Anke, I will pass it off to you to start off your presentation and do a brief intro of yourself.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It was a super exciting presentation, so I'm super happy that I'm here and I'm able to listen in to all of the good experts talking today. So thanks again, Eugene. To introduce myself, so my name is Anke Liu. I work on ecosystem growth at the Stellar Development Foundation. And over the last few years, I've helped evolve one of the longest running grant programs in Web3 called the Stellar Community Fund. So this talk isn't necessarily going to be a how-to or a perfect blueprint for success, but I'll walk through some of the things that I've learned and how I see grant design through adaptive innovation ecosystem thinking, as well as complex system thinking. And so if it helps your planning, that's great. If it saves you a few mistakes down the line, even better. So, you know, when we look at grant programs and ecosystem kind of in general, like most grants and ecosystem support programs can be designed like construction plans, like industry, company, or network ecosystems actually behave more like complex adaptive systems, which entail many different actors, constant feedback loops, and are decentralized with no single control point. And this is especially true in Web3. And so grant programs must act as feedback machines, not static pipelines, in my opinion. And so when we move beyond the role of a grant program manager into something more like a systems architect, our job is to design support that learns and adjusts, not just funds and hopes. And so to map overall ecosystem progression, and I'm taking kind of an inspiration point from I guess biological ecosystems here, like forests. I also wanted to take some of the inspiration from the Grant Maturity Index to use 4 different phases: inception, expansion, inception, traction, expansion, and maturity. So when we talk about inception, it's more about exploration, learning, defining use cases in focus, and usually the tech that you're working on or developing within your ecosystem will be in testnet. Traction is to prove product market fit of initial use cases and improve overall developer experience, a phase where the tech usually moves from testnet and gradually opening up to mainnet. Then comes expansion to scale and incentivize outcomes and overall usage when the ecosystem really starts to grow and strengthen those use cases created in the traction phase, where more applications become on board to use them. And then finally, maturity, which comes with institutionalization to further expand the reach and impact of the ecosystem. And these phases are usually not cookie cutter. They are usually overlapping in periods, but there are some clear indicators that you can put into place for an ecosystem to understand in what phase you're moving from. So these also may not be strictly sequential in certain situations. So for instance, when your ecosystem is restructuring, or you may have areas that, let's say, are in different phases due to, for instance, like new feature development, they can actually overlap and you can have multiple phases in one single ecosystem. So for example, Stellar, which has been around since 2015, focused mostly on payments, added smart contract functionality in 2023, which opened up the creation of a whole new smart contracts ecosystem, which needed to be built around the network. And I'll briefly share an example of what that looked like. So in the inception phase of the Stellar smart contracts ecosystem, we really focused on tinkerers and experiments building on testnet and funding the development for building blocks to create a minimum viable ecosystem. These are oracles, indexers, initial protocols, and wallets that could support them. And then in the traction phase, we supported the connection of the building blocks to create a few end-to-end solutions that gain traction while going on mainnet. And then also supporting seeding initial liquidity and supplying additional support for security audits, as well as strengthening some of the infrastructure and tooling that was created or as a building block in the initial inception phase. So now we're currently moving between traction and expansion, where we're looking at go-to-market support, amping up marketing grants, user incentive competitions. We did a pilot recently. I'm very excited to roll out in the next coming weeks, as well as fostering more ecosystem connection, including incentivizing integrations. We're also, we're also expanding our ambassador network and delegating some of the project incubation on a local level. And also this entire strategy is supported by key partnerships and collaborations, including PayPal, UNHCR, but also interoperability collaborations. I think yesterday we announced Near Intents. So super excited that we were able to roll that one out. And so this is how we're sort of thinking about this in the smart contracts ecosystem growth specifically, and hopefully within the 2026 reach maturity in 2027. But as you can also see, usually these stages, they take each step of the way, might take a bit longer to actually move from stage to stage. So, when actually, when you're thinking about what defines ecosystem growth across these phases, I wanted to map and when I was thinking about yesterday, is how can I actually give some tangible examples to you to use? I'm thinking about roughly 6 dimensions. We're talking about technical infrastructure. These are the toolings, the protocols, smart contracts, developer engagement, and this can also be founders and startups and companies in the ecosystem. So the number of quality of those building in the ecosystem. Then we have user adoption. These are active users, use case traction, wallet and dApp growth, TVL, indicators that indicate usage, as well as funding maturity. So availability of the structure of funding from grants to VCs, etc. Finally, we have governance and coordination. So the community is a very important part of ecosystem growth, decision-making maturity, shared norms, maybe even some DAO or infrastructure that you have around that. Ecosystem interoperability, not to forget. So what connects the ecosystem or the tech with the wider industry, or perhaps with traditional solutions. So this can be crossing bridges, composability, external integrations to TradFi, DeFi, etc. Important to note is that these, and why I put them in a radar chart like this, is that these are mutually reinforcing and dependent on one another. So when you try to grow your ecosystem, you will find that you have a lot of chicken egg situations where you kind of need to grow one in order to grow the other. And so dev engagement, for instance, stalls without proper infrastructure and funding, users churn without proper ecosystem interoperability, funding maturity requires adequate governance and coordination. And so this means that your growth strategies also need to address these across the board so that not one dimension stays behind. And also, I will be available for some questions afterwards, so definitely keep them ready or already add them in the chat. Another helpful framework, as I was looking into resources for this slide, for this presentation, is from General Organization of Business Research and Strategy. A lot what happens in Web3, we can take learnings from outside as well. So something that I found helpful is, before you actually start to design your grant program approaches on an adaptive basis, you can decide how to move. So these are 3 different approaches that you can decide to do on how you will do your grant approach or ecosystem growth approach. So one would be to buy and leverage. So what are the assets or resources that you can tap into immediately? These can be users, infra, dev bases, then encourage or interact. So what are the near adjacent actors or people who are just need a little bit of encouragement that you can maybe pull in with incentives? And then there's built from scratch. So this is really capabilities or culture that you must invest in, and they take usually a longer time to cultivate. So for instance, like I can take a few examples here. So I would say like a blockchain like Base can really leverage the Coinbase user base for like a fast, I guess, acceleration of adoption. And this could be like more of like a buy leverage strategy, where also like Monad, for instance, I can attract kind of EVM devs that are more interested into scalable solutions. So these are really focused on like the encourage part. I think also a lot of like what we were focused on was mostly, and I have like more slides here. And so this is something that you can leverage across different dimensions. So for instance, something that the Stellar ecosystem is quite strong in was existing a connection with TradFi and kind of on and off ramp solutions. So that's something that we heavily leaned into when thinking about our strategies and kind of what is the easiest way for growth, because we don't have infinite time, money, or resources. All right. And I know that there will be a talk about pluralism a bit later on, which is super exciting. But to be able to support these adaptive ecosystem building processes, you will need a pluralistic grant approach that supports successive, like stage-aware grants. So this is like specific based on like the development stage. Also segmented by category. So you usually grant programs, they support the entire stack of an ecosystem, from infra, tooling, dApps, governance, protocols. Also being diversified in your source as well as mechanism. For different sources, you might want to use something else. So for instance, like you might have investors that can invest in some of the companies. You can have foundations, DAO or community grants that fund kind of like different types of governance or applications, and also specialized kind of targeted funds. So when you choose to, like the method that you choose how to fund can be specific depending on what you're trying to do. This can be prospective, retroactive public goods funding, like these can be security audits or bounties. And what these are will kind of shift with the phase that you're in, as well as what you can uniquely leverage for your ecosystem, as we discussed in the previous slide. So I wanted to I guess like these next few slides are really about looking into like a few specific examples and also like a few specific learnings that we had. And again, these are not exhaustive, but for instance, when you're trying to go to from the inception to the traction phase, something that we often see is that the tech can be immature, and so like things can break. Kind of like DevX might developers might actually complain like, hey, they might have a hard time scaling up quickly. And so something that can be used specifically for this is like having bounties or like micro grants, like tiny like RFPs, things like that. Also, like oftentimes in like an early phase of an ecosystem, you kind of see that the use case or the ecosystem definition might be unclear. It might not be fully clear to the community itself, like what actually the ecosystem stands for. There might be competing narratives, et cetera. And so like what usually helps define the use cases or the kind of ecosystem definition is like what the actual minimum, kind of like what the use cases can offer and kind of which use cases are the strongest. So I would definitely focus in this case on more of a specific, like designing a few end-to-end flows that can really showcase the power and the definition and impact of that ecosystem and how it and set the stage for growth. There can also be educational and tooling gaps that you can offer here. I think one of the key learnings that we had, I guess that I kind of learned the hard way, I would say, is that we, in the beginning and in the inception phase, we, well, not overfunded, but we definitely like funded like longer builds. So the tech wasn't quite ready yet, so it was still in development. Things were still changing. The infrastructure was still being built. Most of the builders were solo devs. And they had quite a hard time actually to go through that initial phase to actually build a successful business. So a lot of those like grants, they had to kind of like get grants again to actually like build new features, et cetera, to actually build an end-to-end solution. If I probably had to do it over again, I would have done it a little bit differently. But that's just something to kind of showcase that you need to design for the phase that you're in and that you cannot necessarily rush ahead if you want to move fast. Another one, I think I created a few situations here that you might encounter when you go from traction to expansion. And specifically, like good to notice is that like sometimes you might notice, oh, actually, I got a lot of people on the network, but there's actually not too much product market fit. There's like low retention, like high churn. This can something that can help here are milestone grants. Like we've been really working with like accelerators and residencies as well, which we've seen like really great support in. And I know that Octant is also speaking about the accelerator later. So this is definitely something to look into. Interoperability gaps will kind of come like as like from specifically if you move into the traction phase, because you might notice that, oh, initially I funded this Oracle and now they're actually, you know, because let's say like in the inception phase or the traction phase, there weren't too many users of that Oracle, and now like the maintenance has gone down. And so actually having integration grants or kind of standards or kind of like things like that can really help here, as well as like I would highlight the security concerns. Security is a really important part of Web3 ecosystems, and making sure that you have proper support for audit credits and like security tooling, even like bounties for the tech itself, as specifically as you go on mainnet or prior to projects launching on mainnet. This will be incredibly important. And something that we've noticed recently is where we had a lot of, I guess, like separate ecosystem components or tooling or things here and there that sort of have been built and people kind of want to have a purpose for it. We've had a lot of like new like composability hackathons or composathons, as you can kind of use it here, to encourage like integration and encourage usage and encourage actually building on those open source repos instead of having them being standalone and die out slowly. So yeah, and then finally, going from expansion to maturity. And so this is something where I will still need to let you know about my learnings. But what's really important here is that you fund performance, that you co-fund, like go-to-market support marketing, so that like the companies and the builders that are working are set up for success when it comes to actually going to market, actually finding product market fit. Liquidity is a big thing as well. And then I think like this is especially when governance bottlenecks start to kind of like show. There can be a low turnout, perceived bias. And so this is something where you also want to really focus on amping up your governance as you go into further into expansion as well. And then obviously we have the tooling and infra and interoperability gaps from previous phases. All right, so I think that's about my time. I think I might have a few minutes for questions.
We have a few minutes for questions. Thank you for that, Anka. And we do have already one question, which is wonderfully being highlighted here. So yeah, it comes from Ben. So first off, just thank you on the shout out for GMI. And from your experience, what advice would you give to a program designer just starting out? So at that inception phase and a mature program to make taking the next step a success?
That's a good question. I think definitely like when it comes to starting out, so I'll start there. It's really important to find that narrative or that like final kind of like goal or kind of like what the ecosystem, kind of what makes the ecosystem unique or what defines the ecosystem, and then staying true to that, and then identifying, well, what are the KPIs and kind of indicators that can support that mission, so you would say. So that actually having kind of the entire growth or the and also the community that you're and the builders that you're building it with, having being it aligned to one like vision or mission can be really helpful, so that you kind of like stay on a path towards ecosystem growth and don't end up diverging all over the place and not actually achieving much growth. So specifically, like for the foundation, like I mean, at the foundation, we have a mission to create equitable access to the global financial system, and so a lot of the choices and the funding choices that we make, but also that have been sort of also translated to the community finding they're very important, are all related to access to financial services. And so specifically, that's what we have really narrated our approach upon. But you may need to make changes into that, because in order to kind of make sure that you provide access to financial services, you also need to kind of keep up. You need to add kind of functionality that can suppose that. You need to empower builders to be able to build those solutions. So like the how is definitely like the how do you do that is something that the community can help you with, but having kind of like a specific mission and something that makes it unique can really help. Then I would also say to just start small. So one of the big, I think, well, not big mistakes necessarily, but one of the things that I would have done different if I was starting over is by really like honing in on the inception phase, like start like really funding building blocks, start making sure that people are building on one another, like learn from those things before starting into long-term builds, because the tech is just going to change so much still at that phase. That like what you build today will not be like relevant anymore in 3 months. So kind of focusing specifically on kind of what makes that phase really stand out will be most effective, and you might achieve the fastest growth. But I think it might be on time, so I'm going to answer in chat for the rest.
Yes, yeah, please, either in chat or in Twitter, wherever feels good. But Anke, thank you so much for the presentation and for sharing some of the wisdom. It is really cool seeing the various aspects of SDF, and I know this was not enough time to cover all the nuances and various parts of the cool things y'all have built in the ecosystem there. So please look up Anke's other talks that she's given at many a conference, and you can learn all about it. But with that, I am going to pass off the MC duties to you, Anke, so you could tee up our next presenter. So yeah, with that, I'll pass it off to you.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, Eugene, for the MC duty. I'm so super excited as I'm also part of our key contributor of the Metagov Grants Innovation Lab. And as such, I'm happy to also start an MC duty. Next up, we have Federico from the Ethereum Foundation speaking about the Ethereum grants. I'm super excited to learn more. And if you have any questions, please put them into the chat now so that I can ask them at the end.
Hi, Anke. Hope everybody can hear me fine. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me today to discuss how the Ethereum Foundation is working on evolving its grants program. We are going to talk of what is going to change, why this change matters, what's staying the same, and how this all will look in practice. My name is Federico Landini, and I lead the newly established grants management team at the Ethereum Foundation. This team is an evolution of the former ecosystem support program team. My role here is to lead the redesign of the EF grants program to improve efficiency, transparency, and impact. Most of you are probably familiar with the EF grants and the ecosystem support program, which have been running since 2018. In 2024 alone, we supported around 600 plus projects and initiatives, with over 100 awarded through the ESP open application process through the ESP website that you can see in this slide. Our funding covers a wide range of areas, starting from research to dev tooling to data analytics, and a wide range of community projects and education. In this slide, I try to highlight a small example of the diversity of projects that we helped bring to life. Cool. Now that we have looked to where we are today and what we did in the past, we are going to start looking in what we want to do next. The Ethereum ecosystem and network is growing up. As we all know, just last month, we celebrated its 10th anniversary, but I don't think this is just a question of age. If we look to any application and any adoption chart, we can see that the network is becoming, and the ecosystem are becoming larger, more complex, and more visible. I don't think it's only a question of data as well. I think it's kind of energy that we are all feeling at the moment. And we believe that at this moment, with this growth, our approach to ecosystem support should also mature. First of all, we want to make clear that there are core values that will remain the same. We still want to back critical projects that strengthen the Ethereum resilience and usability. We will still want to support public goods and open source, and we are still focusing on builder tools, infrastructure, research, and community initiatives. But we want to improve or evolve the way how we do this. We want to especially focus on two areas that we think that are particularly important. First of all, we want to be more strategic about the grants funding that we do. And to do so, we want to introduce and to focus more on RFPs and wish lists. And we want to involve other EF teams more directly in defining the priorities and the goals that we want our initiatives to be focusing on. And secondly, we want to improve execution by increasing support to grantees through the grant life cycle, building stronger relationships with them, and having a greater focus on the outcome and impact. So if we wanted to summarize in one simple sentence, we can say that we want to fund what matters and support it all the way. We don't want just to cut checks. We want to identify the right opportunities and help them succeed. So this is how the grants program will evolve, but these changes are not isolated. They are part of broader changes that are happening at the EF and that touch broadly how the EF approaches ecosystem development. So recently we introduced several new teams that are grouped in 4 different clusters that approach and help the ecosystem grow from different perspectives, focusing mostly on non-financial support. So what are these 4 clusters? So there is the ecosystem acceleration cluster with teams that focus on helping accelerating the pace of ecosystem growth. Then we have ecosystem amplification, where teams work on amplifying the reach of our activities. Ecosystem support, that is the cluster that the grants management team is part of, that is focusing on coordinating both financial and non-financial support. And finally, the long-term ecosystem unblocking team cluster, where teams are working to remove obstacles to adoption around the world. These are new ways and new tools that EF will use to drive the growth and to work together with the ecosystem. We are quite excited of this new structure, and we believe that these new teams can unblock several positive feedback loops that will really strengthen our activity. So I will try to make you a quick and simple example. So let's take a colleague that is working on the developer growth team, part of the ecosystem acceleration cluster. So in their daily work, they are talking every day with builders and developers across the Ethereum ecosystem. And they can collect questions, pain points, and feedback that can be a direct input for our wish list and RFPs, and will drive what we are going to fund and setting goals and objectives for our grants initiatives. In turns, what our grantees build, so the outcomes can be shared back with the same team, and the same team can showcase these tools to the builders and the developers, ensuring that there is visibility and adoption and maximum impact in the end for the outcomes of our funding. Okay, so these are the changes we are working on, both on grants management side and on ecosystem support generally. We are, of course, very excited about them, From a timeline-wise perspective, I would like to share a couple of dates that are important for this transition period. So the open application process that is currently live on the Ecosystem Support Program website will be paused on August 29th. During this pause period, we will still have office hour sessions that are available to the community, to the ecosystem, where people can fill a form and get in contact with us for a call to discuss anything, basically, how we can help, but it will be very much focused on non-financial support. We are planning to reopen the application process with RFP, with wishlist, and the new model during Q4. If you would like to stay up to date with the latest updates, know exactly the dates that we will reopen the program, I suggest you to follow our website or follow our X account, where you will find all this information. And if you have any question, suggestion, or feedback, you can always reach out to me directly to my email address that I linked here. Well, thank you again for the time and the attention. I hope you are as excited as we are for the next phase of the EF Grants program. And if there is any question, I'm happy to discuss it with you.
Yeah, well, thank you again. This is super insightful. I think it's really exciting to see how the Ethereum Foundation has evolved with various ecosystem support vehicles now. I guess while we wait for questions, and definitely ask them in the X space, what have been some of the biggest learnings you've had when making these changes?
I mean, we're still in the process. I think that, as we said in the presentation, there are several changes happening at the same time in the ecosystem. Like, the ecosystem is growing, as we discussed. The Ethereum Foundation as a whole is changing. The strategy of ecosystem support, but of the Ethereum Foundation in general, is shifting. There are several posts by Vitalik and our new EDs that highlight the strategy. So we really thought that is the right moment to change, to evolve, as we said in the presentation, and really start focusing on strategic funding initiatives.
Super exciting. All right. Let me see if there's any. All right. It seems like we are up on time. Yeah, if you have any questions for Federico, don't hesitate to put it in the X chat. We will be up. We will be ready for our next presentation shortly. But I guess, Federico, is there anything else that you would like to share with the audience before leaving?
As I said, I think that it's an interactive process. We work for the ecosystem. So I think that in case of feedback or questions, reach us out through my email address that I posted in the presentation, but also you can post to us to our Twitter account. Really, input is welcome. This is I think something, as I mentioned, that we are very excited, and we think that really the feedback loop that I described, we are very excited about. But input from the community is always welcome. And just hit me up on my email address or in other ways.
Sounds good. Exciting. Well, definitely share some of the links, maybe the presentation that you shared. People would love to follow up and get more in touch with what's going on with the Ethereum Foundation. All right. Let's see. Next up, we have our next speaker is Themes with Rethinking Web3 Grants with Capital Design. And Themes, it has been such a pleasure working with you also to organize the Grants Summit today, over the past few, I guess, weeks or months now. So super excited to also have to hear what you're bringing to the conference today. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. All right.
Okay.
Yeah, take it away.
Can you see me as well? Sorry. I just want to ensure that everything's okay. You see my screen?
Yes, all should be good.
Okay, awesome. So my name is Themes, and today I'll be talking about capital design and ways that we can actually implement it within Web3 grants. I'll also be introducing my capital design framework, which is an example of capital design called CAMP, which is the Capital Architecture Mapping Framework. Kind of long, so that's why I call it CAMP. But beforehand, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Themes, as I said. I'm a grant strategist, researcher at the intersections of capital allocation system design. I've actually experienced the full workflow or role flow of grants. So as a funder, as an operator, as an assessor, and as a grantee, not even ones on just fixed grant programs, but also as a decentralized reviewer as well. And so why capital design? So I've started to see like much more commonalities or kind of limited gaps when it came to grant funding and program design and impact, primarily in understanding what the roles are within the full system flow, as well as like what is the exact why. And so this is kind of what I'm hoping to answer using this example. A lot of this research has also, or this framework has also been built on my past experiences as well as my research. And so primarily in the last 2 years, I've been focusing on grant program design and capital allocation, specifically around growth programs, so hackathons, accelerators, and grant programs. I have released 2 research papers this year, that focus on capital design and funding structures. The first one is organizational structure, which looked at the EF's multi-layered funding concept, as well as funding by design, which then applies a life cycle approach to it. With GIL, I was part of the State of Web3 grants, as well as Grant Maturity Index with Ben. So what is capital design? Capital design applies to system thinking to funding. So basically think of it as like a sitemap meets with like communication architecture. And why it matters is it structures how capital decisions are framed, funded, and evaluated. So my inspirations for this were actually 3. One of them was Simon Sinek's The Golden Circle. And by doing that exercise, I was actually able to develop mission, visions, values, and copy content around digital strategy for websites and for brands as well. I was also influenced by the grant lifecycle management frameworks that are applied into Philanthropy, in which before funding, they actually apply a strategy, so pre-award, to really understand who they're trying to attract and what impact before they fund it will actually have. So there's already a hypothesis built into design. And then the third is a sitemap. And I think a sitemap is a really great visual to see how everything kind of moves within a website, and also what the roles are within that website, the objectives and categorization. As a researcher in Web3, one of the biggest kind of gaps have been communication, like information, categorization, and standardization. And so by introducing this framework and also the idea of capital design, I'm hoping that we can kind of move towards much more of a standardization so that we can actually assess impact in a more impactful way. So within my research and experience, some of the biggest systematic issues facing grants and grant design have been misalignment. And what I mean by that is that the original intention for that grant program might not actually align with the strategic focus or long-term planning of that protocol. Other aspects of this too is that what we also see is that through these pluralistic grant programs, many programs happen at the same time, but there is really no coordination to learn from one another or actually understand the uniqueness of each program that is happening within an ecosystem. And when I say ecosystem, I mean the ecosystem that is funding the program as well as funding the recipients. And I think that we have allowed kind of a much more open impact in regards to ecosystem impact in terms of funding. And so what this really does is that it really looks at the original funder's intention and objectives. And in terms of the accountability, not necessarily weak, but limited, because things move so fast and we are trying to get as much of the work done, we don't necessarily have time to figure out what went wrong outside of the process. And so what I see a lot is strategic drift. What that is that there's a long-term objective of maybe an ecosystem or protocol that might not align within the workflow of a grant program. So whether from, not really understanding as an assessor, for me, a decentralized assessor, from a protocol that I'm not necessarily part of, but asked to review, understanding what their strategic goals or objectives in assessing these applicants sometimes is difficult because I don't know how to connect the two. And then what that also leads is to subjectivity. And in terms of impact assessments, it's more of a one-size-fits-all model. So CAMP, the Capital Architecture Mapping Framework, is a capital design and systems framework that maps roles, mechanisms, and capital flows across life cycle phases to ensure funding is deployed, tracked, and strategic with clear accountability, alignment to ecosystem goals. It focuses on programs like grants, hackathons, and accelerators. So the way that I was actually thinking about it was around economic growth. Primarily about what does that actually look like? What does growth look like on a return of investment sort of way? So there are obviously specific categories that might not fit this particular viewpoint. In process, it would make it much more effective, but for this, I'm actually looking at ROI. So things like consumer applications, DeFi would work. Ones that can actually be measured by monetary value. So the investment that you put in, there's an expectation of return. And so if the return of, increasing of users or network usage then can be converted, because in the assessment, it's all about the numbers. Whereas ones that might at this current stage, because of the differentiation of the definitions of them and the impact could differ depending on the ecosystem, public goods and open source software might not be as appropriate in measuring it as in funding ROI. But the logic and the process could still work for these types of programs, but that was primarily the intention in designing this is most likely like return of investment, so that we can actually create value on work and actually understand what the monetary impact would be in the investment through grants. So CAMP actually doesn't just focus on grants. What it does look at are specific elements as well around capital allocation. And so primarily it works on mechanisms. And then one of the mechanisms is is it a grant? Is it a hackathon? Is it an accelerator? And so there you get to really understand whether or not these particular allocation mechanisms were the best. Because what I've also seen is sometimes grants are used as a catch-all or a kind of marketing initiative. And so if you're trying to align a mechanism maybe for a different objective, it might be that the mechanism used isn't the most appropriate for that objective, rather than it being the mechanism's fault. In terms of domains, what I've also found that it's easier to assess things on a domain level rather than multiple domains in a program, because sometimes the output or the impact of consumer as opposed to DeFi could be very, very different. So, understanding who you're trying to attract and how you're trying to assess them, it would not be as equitable in assessing the impact if you just put them all in one thing. And so what CAMP actually looks at is it goes on a more niche level of understanding what the mechanism is first, and then understanding what domain within that mechanism, and then going through the workflow. It's more of a communication and strategy exercise that then provides outputs, which I will then show. And then Anchors kind of addresses how funding within each different actor that is involved in funding, whether it's the program, the recipient, the funder, and how they're related to one another within the workflow. So from a program design, how is that impacted? From a assessment design, how is that impacted? From a design side, how is that impacted as well? And so these are really checkpoints, more like questions, that kind of go through the different life cycles, which I will then share, depending on the different actors. And so what it does is that it connects every action whether it's from the grantee's perspective or the operator's perspective, to one another, as well as within the lifecycle approach. So camp roles are basically like the roles that are impacted mostly by the capital allocation. And I think that like how this is a little bit different is that rather than looking at the individual, what this really does is really create a responsibility for the capital allocation role. So it's not an individual's fault, it's basically a shared it's a shared responsibility. But what it also does is that it connects all of the players within the funding ecosystem. So really also grantees and builders can actually see themselves in the long-term strategy, but also original funders and capital allocators can actually align program design to the original strategy and the long-term objectives of that protocol. And so they are the original funder, and those are the individuals or groups that set the directions and defines the capital goals. They're the ones who approve the funding. The capital allocator is the ones who are either design or runs programs. They translate strategy into action. And a sub-allocator is basically one that manages the track within a grant program. So for example, you have the ESP from EF, but then you also have academic grants. And so if the ESP runs the full grant program within a particular domain, you have others who are also running a program independently, but still connected to the strategic objective of the bigger grant. And this also what this does is that it actually connects all of the players. And because what I've also seen is that programs run in silos, and then it doesn't have like a shared responsibility within it. And then recipients, of course, are the builders, the individuals, not necessarily just builders, but individuals who apply and deliver ecosystem value. And so the lifecycle approach that I've applied to CAMP has three. So there's the design, the fund, and the assess. And so the design phase, it asks like, why fund this particular program? Why are we using this particular mechanism? So like, why grants, and who should apply? And this is really important in terms of the who should apply, because you're actually thinking about outside of categories. What are the most ideal grantees that you would like to apply for this, and why? So in the beginning, you're actually not thinking about activity input, but you're actually thinking about what is it, like what are the characteristics of these particular grantees that we're looking at attracting within a mechanism, for this mechanism, within a domain. So we can't necessarily, I mean, it would make it much more aligned for us to kind of think about who we're trying to attract to apply for this grant under specific domains and why, rather than a catch-all. Because that way you're able to actually attract the right types of people. And so in the fund phase is that this is the program is already funded and it's basically ready to be executed. So here it's like, what are the funding priorities? Which projects are to approve, and how will funds be dispersed? And this is more about, is it like milestone-based disbursements, or once like just like one disbursement, or you know, staggered, or so forth. So here is where you actually kind of decide the rules, which I'll get into much in the next slide. And then in the assess phase is that everything is assessed, and not just only in terms of grantee output, because I think a lot of kind of assessment is either on program activity or grantee output, but not necessarily tying it to the original strategy or objective or the long-term planning. So here we get to see the different kind of assessment from a funder's perspective, from a program's perspective, and then from a grantee's perspective. And then we're able to actually have a shared responsibility, again, not for a blame game, so that we're a much more connected ecosystem within the funded ecosystem. So here I'm actually talking about the ecosystem that's funding, and not necessarily the Ethereum ecosystem. It's, yeah, so that you have much more connection to who you're funding, and you can actually see yourselves as part of like the long-term strategy. So CAMP in practice. So CAMP is actually an exercise that I do through using like questions and anchors and documentation, but in practice, it basically kind of looks like this. So in the design area, we're here, you focus on defining the purpose and the strategic gaps. So we want to do a program. We don't know what kind of program, of grants, a hackathon, or whatever, to meet these particular strategic gaps. And so rather than just like, we want it for growth, it's like, okay, but like, what type of growth are you actually looking for? And is this like short-term or long-term? And then that way you're actually really able to kind of refine what exactly is the output and the purpose of this program and why grants are the best mechanisms for this. And so then you kind of test it against grants. Like, okay, well, we want, to grow more users. Okay, great. If you want to grow more users, is a grant program the best? Is a hackathon? Is an accelerator? Do you want to have them for long-term or short-term and so forth? And then here also is where you get to identify the target domains and you clarify eligibility. So who should apply? Again, that's very important. It's like, who do you want to apply outside of just the category? Like, what are the characteristics that they would have outside of feasibility? Like, what is the impact? Like, what should they already have in terms of user bases? So it's much more niche in terms of like activity output and value. And then in terms of the roles in design is the original funder defines the gaps and sets purposes and approves the program. So in this kind of camp design, it doesn't necessarily work as well for ad hoc DAO grant proposals that, you submit a proposal, then you get a grant, because it would require really a top level to kind of decide what are actually the gaps and that this actually sets, and like whether or not this mechanism is the best. And because of, differentiation of, how proposals can get, approved, it doesn't allow much more consistency in order for me to build much more standardization around this. So this is much of a closed grant program that kind of like runs consecutively in the design area, as this is where it would work best. From a capital allocator, they would design and run the program, manage funding flows, intake, rubrics, and risk controls. So here is like actually, I'll get to the communication assets, what actually comes out of it. And then the recipient in the design applies if aligned with focused domains and ready to deliver impact. So the communication assets that are developed from this is like program descriptions and purpose, application process and guidelines, selection rubric and criteria, and assessment and evaluation framework. So in the design phase, these are the types of assets that would then be delivered, so that within the workflow, it kind of aligns with the objective and the strategic plan. The fund phase is the program is funded. And the focus areas, it's like it sets the funding priorities, which domains, which projects to support first. It approves the recipients and the grants amounts. It defines disbursements, and it establishes deliverables and accountability expectations. And the roles within this are, with the original funder, they're the ones who provide the capital and confirm the alignment. So yes, we approve it. With the capital allocators, in this case, it's the grant operators. They would review the proposals, select the projects, and approve the grant amounts. And then the recipients are the ones who will apply to the program and commit to deliverables like before. In the communication outputs, they would be selection of the notices to the applicants. So like, you have been approved and this is what our agreements are, and the funding disbursements and agreements and the outlining obligations. And then finally is the assess phase, I guess, where we get to assess the impact, not again from just the grantees output, but from a program level, from a mechanism level, and from a domain level. And so here we get to measure the results, evaluate the effectiveness of the mechanism, assess the capital efficiency and ROI, impact versus funds spent, and decide whether to renew, scale, redesign, or sunset the program. This was actually designed within a shorter life cycle, so between 6 months, because I believe that you need at least 3 months to understand whether or not there's actually been impact from the grantees. Again, this is limited to particular domains in order for you to actually see the impact within it. The roles within this is that it judges if the mechanism's delivered on ecosystem intent and capital goals. From the capital allocators or grant program operators, it analyzes the outcomes, compiles the reporting, and recommends adjustment. So the difference is the original funder will assess the program as a whole, and the mechanism and the domain of, did it really align? And the capital allocator will then assess the activity within it, within the program. And then the recipient will then report on their milestones, their impact, and their lessons learned. And so communication outputs for these would be like impact reports, renewal redesign recommendations, and recipient performance reviews. And so finally, how CAMP creates values. And so for funders, it creates a return of investment clarity. So capital flows from intent to outcome. So there's no broken telephone. The risk reduction and accountability prevents waste. So duplicated efforts, much more alignment, efficiency in funds and targeted priority domains. And then this also helps with the assessment of those domains as well. For operators or allocators, it's a lower overhead. So you definitely get much more fewer misaligned applications, accountability, so lifecycle tracking and transparent reporting. So it also will help you with the communication at the end, as well as visibility. So clear decision flows and new duplications within different types of programs. And for recipients, builders, grantees, you get a higher win rate. You only apply when aligned. You get fairer reviews. Rubrics are replaced with subjectivity because it aligns with actually strategic objective and within your particular domain. And there's an actual pathway. So renewal, graduation beyond one-off grants, which are also a gap that is within grants, is like, how do you create an exit strategy or a life cycle for grantees? And also, how do grantees get feedback on whether or not they've actually had impact? And by actually clearly defining or adjusting different programs specifically to strategic objectives, it would then allow grantees an understanding of whether or not this particular grant or whatever they're building is aligned with the long-term strategy or short-term strategy of the protocol that is funding it. Thank you. If you want to connect with me, I'm on X at Themes Chats. And so I'm open to any questions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I don't know how, but there we go.
Thank you for that, Themes. I guess since there are no other questions, we're going to head straight into our next session. My name is Mike Cooper. I'm a contributor to the Grant Innovation Lab with Metagov. And today I'm joined by, Robbie Heeger with Endowment, who's going to talk to us a lot about new different types of funding mechanisms and how those funding mechanisms are identified and tested as a solution to creating impact. So with that, Robbie, why don't I turn it over for you for an introduction?
Hey, thanks, Mike. It's great to be here, and real pleasure to be included in the Grant Summit this year. I think it's always great to just come and learn about what other people are doing. And I think there's so much diversity in grant programs. And so, hopefully this session and this conversation can be a little bit less about ecosystem funding and a little bit more about just how to run grant programs. We are a very unique use case in the broader Web3 space, on-chain economy, in that Endowment is a community foundation built specifically for us as a on-chain native or internet native investor class that has an asset base that isn't traditionally accepted by the Vanguard, Fidelity, or Schwab charitables of the world. And so Endowment serves as a donor advised fund sponsor and community foundation philanthropic services provider for the broader Web3 community. And that's the lens with which we look through grant making programs, right? So there's, of course, the ecosystem development grant making, but there's also, other kinds of grant making out there. And we're bringing one of the older paradigms of nonprofit donations, of charitable contributions, to the new tool set of quadratic matching and decentralized governance and digital asset-based donations, in addition to, just some of the more traditional, I have a nonprofit that I want to give some money to because I saw an article about them online, and so I'm going to click the donate now button. So that's a little bit about what we do. We've raised over $107 million. I think we're almost at $108 million in donations over the 5 years we've been around. We have granted out of that $107 million, about 95 plus has gone out already. And the remaining is presently invested in a variety of different on-chain and off-chain investment opportunities. And those grow tax-free until the original donor determines where they want to grant them out to. And as far as sort of autonomous or decentralized allocation mechanisms that we have on endowment, our core vehicle for matching funds is called the Universal Impact Pool, which we built in conjunction with Allo and Gitcoin to use the grant stack to basically watch all of the protocol activity. So if somebody comes and makes a gift on endowment, or if they open a donor advised fund and make a grant from a donor advised fund to a nonprofit on endowment, we're using all of that protocol activity as passive voting strategies for the quadratic matching algorithm at the end of each quarter. So every quarter we have a little trickle of our matching pool going out. And that matching pool is getting allocated based on, over the past quarter, what organizations, what nonprofits have gotten donations or grants on the platform. And so it's sort of this retroactive assessment of what are the most important issues in the world right now based on the curatorial efforts of people's donation behavior.
Yeah.
So it is not something that we really publicize, right? It's something that happens retroactively. It's kind of like retro PGF.
Yeah.
And what we're doing is we are funding the matching pool with the assets of the donors who kind of hit it and quit it, to be maybe a little bit crass. But there's a criticism of philanthropy in the US, a valid criticism, I would say, of philanthropy in the US, that people come and they open up these investment vehicles that are tax deductible. They're called donor advised funds.
Right.
And they put a bunch of money into it, and then they never send it out. And they get the tax break and they just kind of say, okay, I got my tax break. Like, who cares what happens to this money?
Yeah.
And so they disappear. And we feel like that's a little crooked, that doesn't sit so well with us. And so we made the Universal Impact Pool. We were like, okay, QF can help us address this problem. And so what we do is we say, if you come and you ditch your account, if you come, you put money into it and you say, okay, I got the tax deduction, I don't care about it anymore, and you ditch it for 2 years or more, we start draining that account little by little, 1 quarter at a time, 10% at a time. We start draining that account into the matching pool. And so in that way, we're saying for those people who are actively supporting causes on endowment, we're taking the inactive money and allocating it each quarter, a portion of that inactive money, to the actual nonprofits that are getting support throughout the previous quarter. And so that's why I sort of, suggested the title of like using passive QF to decentralize philanthropy, because ultimately that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, okay, if you don't know what you want to support, or if you come and just drop money off for the tax deduction, you should get allocated smartly to nonprofits that need funding. And so we're using our broader community's giving activity as the basis for who should get allocated capital, not hey, everybody go tell your community to come do this. It's like, we're saying like, we do a little bit of promotion at the end of the quarter. Like, it's your last chance, to like influence the distribution. But like, ultimately that doesn't really move the numbers that much as what we've seen. We've been doing this for like two years and a quarter. So we've done 9 completed quarters and we're on our 10th quarter now. And it's giving out about $20,000 to $30,000 a quarter. And you know, right now, like I think if you look at the universal impact pool, this round's distribution is going to 88 different orgs, and it's like a couple $100 to each of these orgs, and based on how much donation activity they have. And it's been really, really cool to see how organizations both grok this and go, oh, I should drive my fundraising to this platform so that we get a larger share of the match. And also how donors grok this and say like, oh, if I give a lot of small gifts to a lot of organizations that I care about, they're actually going to get more of the matching pool over time because, you know, I'm spreading my love out, and that's getting them some of this larger pool of capital that maybe, you know, I might only have $100 to give. But if I give $1 to 100 organizations, each of them are going to get the minimum distribution from the UIP, which is going to be $100. So it's like you can do, your giving can go farther and your community can be more impactful. And it's kind of like this big passive aggressive attempt to get people to do more fundraising on chain.
So how are you, I mean, so the primary problem it seems like you're trying to tackle with the use of QF is mitigating just like latent capital that's just sitting there, right? And just incurring opportunity cost because it's not being used. So would you say that like, if that's the biggest problem you were kind of targeting with the use of QF, you know, what's the relationship between that and the impact you want to have, right? You've talked about, well, you know, our goal is to spread as much as we can to as many as we can, which makes it feel like, you know, your definition of impact is exactly that. We want, which is probably how, or maybe why you set your kind of minimal donations. You said it was like 100 USD, right? So what is the relationship between that problem of latent capital and the impact that you're envisioning? And could you kind of get specific on, you know, this is the impact that we want to do, this is how we're measuring it, and this is how QF enables it?
It's a like very, very, very well worded question. I appreciate like the way that you're looking at this problem, because we look at it very similarly internally, which is like, why are we doing this? And like what are we hoping to achieve? And so you're right about the first part, that like what we want to observe is that there is a penalty for giving and not allocating. Right. So coming and just using endowment to get a tax break is something we want to disincentivize. The goal is that you become engaged in your community and that you bring more of the nonprofits in your local town or in your area of interest into the crypto philanthropy space. Right. Like we want reach. Endowment wants brand recognition and reach, and we want orgs to be excited about receiving gifts from us and to start pushing their donors towards the platform, right? We want to increase activity on the protocol, and in that way, it's very similar to like a grants program for, you know, like an ecosystem program for a protocol, right? And at the same time, we want to disincentivize people from the sort of toxic behavior that the vehicle can sometimes bring out because of the alignment of incentives, right? That there's sort of this, for most people in charitable giving, there are two incentives. There's one, to make a difference in the world. And there's two, to get a tax break, at least in the US. Like that's core drivers, right? And some people come just for number two. And we're saying like that. Yeah. That's not the whole point. Right? Like we want you to be active. And so by having this matching pool that either creates the outcome for us or creates the outcome for the bad actor, right? Because if the bad actor comes and disappears, slowly over time, we're allocating all of their capital to a mix of everybody's shared perspective on what causes matter. Yeah. Right. And so in doing so, like we feel good about siphoning off of that account because they've already communicated through their actions that they're not interested in really making the allocation decision. And we're like, that's okay. We will have our community make it for you.
Yeah.
And that's what's exciting about it being passive is like, it's not so much like a campaign that people go out and run. It's more like this is happening automatically in the background.
Yeah. With it being passive, do you have a kind of, you know, what problems have you faced in ramping up your use of QF for the impact pool? And has that affected what your objectives are for the impact pool?
Well, we've definitely seen some orgs, like we spend a lot of time talking internally, and, you know, we do a certain amount of like data cleaning. I think anybody who's run a QF program has done some amount of data cleaning before the final distribution is calculated in order to adjust for Sybil attacks and for, you know, abuse of the system of in some way.
Yeah.
And so that's been a real learning curve for us. And now 2 years in, like, we're getting much better at sort of like, you know, some people will use 4 or 5 different credit cards to make donations to the same organization and try and boost their match from the pool by having the same donor use different payment methods to make small donations, because you want, you know, that's how QF works. And so like we're doing more controlling around, you know, identity fingerprints and, you know, learning from people like Giveth, who have been doing even more complex, like computational Sybil resistance. Like, I think there are people who are doing much more compelling Sybil resistance because they're getting attacked in more complex ways. We're not getting attacked in like the most complex ways for this thing, but we do see orgs doing this behavior where they switch over all of their fundraising methods on their website to endowment. To encourage people to basically come and do their retail gifts at endowment so they get a larger share. And to us, like, that's actually like a good abuse of the system. Like that's the outcome we want. Right? Like, we want people to wind up being more aware of this ultimate giving machine that takes everything under the sun and runs more transparently because it's running on chain, and it runs cheaper because it's running on chain, right? Like that's our value prop to the world. That's our value add. And so I think that there are some behaviors that we do want to encourage. But what we're seeing is that really only happens towards the end of the quarter. And by the end of the quarter, there's actually enough usage of the endowment protocol to where, like, it takes a large gaming operation to actually come and shift the numbers meaningfully. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. You mentioned the word behaviors, and I think that that's one thing we're finding within the Grant Innovation Lab is that these different kinds of funding mechanisms, you know, a lot of the funding mechanisms like QF or others, you know, they incentivize certain types of behaviors, disincentivize other types of behaviors. Some behaviors are automatically just kind of canceled out through just the way that the infrastructure and the ecosystem is designed.
Sure.
But, you know, I picked up on, as soon as you said that, when you talk about adapting your approach, that's one thing you're monitoring, right? Is, you know, who's exerting the behaviors we want, who's exerting the behaviors that we don't want. You know, can you maybe talk a little bit about that and, you know, how you kind of pivot and adapt on that? Because I think that one thing that we're finding within the space is that people usually view the pivots and the adaptation as, you know, only switching mechanisms, and they don't think about other variables that they can change, which in your case might be something like, well, do we change the minimum threshold amounts that are given, right? Where is it worth it to do this for $100, or is it only worth it to do this to try and attack the system for 1,000, for example?
You know, I think we're going to see some changes to the way we run the UIP within the coming year.
Yeah.
And the changes that we're considering is frequency.
Yeah.
Right now we run quarterly and we give away 25% of the value of the DAF each quarter. And that lines up with the way that we handle inactive funds, because we sweep inactive funds every quarter, right? And so like we get a donation coming in, and then, you know, we close out the previous round. And I think like a lot of it has to do with like what won't cause burnout for your protocol team, right? Like I think more than anything in the past year, 2 years, 3 years, like really since 2022, like there's so much burnout in this space about like, can I sustainably run grant programs for 5 years? And I think a lot of people are realizing that like, no, like you need something that is a little bit more always on, kind of runs itself. And so we look to play with the operational support first in order to get us to a place where we can run them more frequently. And I think we will move to a monthly cadence because we want people coming back to the experience. You know, it's like if we can handle it operationally, moving to a monthly cadence is a more exciting way to do more of this. And
cultivating the community, kind of. Yeah,
cultivating the community and the behavior. Right. Yeah. Like right now it's once a quarter, endowment pops up on your feed and it's like the UIP is closing, blah, you know, and it's like, hurry up. Right. And I think, oh, thanks, Rohit. Cool question.
Yeah, that is quite the question. Well done. Yeah.
I love that. You know, I think what we want to get to is a place where the UIP has a lot more money in it. Right. Like we've had a few spaces, you know, with the setting of the minimum. You asked about the setting of the minimum, and you know, Rohit is also asking about the sort of power law, you know, like how do you kind of like smoothen the distribution a little bit? And so we started off with like a $200 minimum grant, and then we came down to 100 because the $200 was flattening it too much.
Yeah.
Like basically everybody was just getting $200 and it was like a different penny, a couple of different pennies each way. Right. And then we dropped it to 50, and then we had like 4 organizations getting like a couple $1,000. And then, you know, the rest of the organizations are getting, you know, 50 to 150. Right. Yeah. And it's like, as we learn more about the UIP, I think there are opportunities to further decentralize the levers at the disposal of the UIP. Like we're treating it mostly internally as like, how do we create the right outcome that we want? We are yet to like decentralize the governance of the UIP because we're still really learning about like what we should do and how it works. And, you know, like, I think with more money in the pool, right, it is this equation of how many organizations on average are getting granted to each quarter. Right now it's about 100 to 150, right? And so you take the $20,000 that we have in the pool that's up for distribution each time, and you divide that by the 150, and then you say like, okay, well, I want to make sure everybody gets something, right? And so as you set that minimum, it sort of forces the calculation to distribute more evenly.
Yeah.
And I think that's particularly interesting. You know, like we will probably look to, I think we're working on a rather large anonymous gift to some alpha leak for us here today in the Grant Summit. We're looking at a rather large, not like Gitcoin QF size, but like a real boost to the size of the UIP. And that's going to allow us to shift the percentage that we're giving out, the minimum distribution, the frequency at which we're giving out, and that will require a recalculation, basically.
I want to leave a couple quick thank you for that. Sorry, and I know like this is one of those conversations we can keep going. I know we've got about 2 minutes left, and we got a couple of quick questions. We'll start with the last one first. You know, essentially, like, you know, given you're expanding the space, you know, what's the role for Web2 orgs and their giving programs in what you've set up? We'll start there.
I'll try to get to both of these questions real quick. we have a 10-year gift from the Nouns Treasury going into the UIP. 10 years, a trickle gift of 1 ETH a month. So it's 120 ETH over 10 years, 1 ETH a month. And I think there's great opportunities for treasuries to make a commitment to sort of like treasury social responsibility, but it's not chic, it's not in vogue, and it doesn't help boost the bags of the community. And so it's like really for more established communities or mission-driven communities. I think in Web 2, you see more people doing corporate social responsibility because they are quite profitable and successful, and then they want to do some engagement. And like, we would love to bring them into that mix. And we're doing more of that, frankly, like as we cross the chasm, as Web 3 becomes just the web, like we're sort of crossing that chasm along with the growth of the industry. And stay tuned. You'll see more from us on that front, in the immediate future. We just announced a new partnership with Active Cause, which works with like creators, influencers, athletes, artists to do fundraising. And that's an opportunity for us to bring in more of these tools to like work with large followings, basically.
Right.
So things along that line. And then
you hit a little bit on the second question. Yeah, go for it though.
Yeah, I hit a little bit on the second question. I think like, I want to be able to do more experimentation with the UIP. And a big part of that is raising the funds to go into the UIP that allows us to experiment at a meaningful size, right? Like right now, there's real interest in the UIP every quarter because it's a real size grant that's coming out of it every quarter, right? Yeah. And so the more that we can fundraise for the UIP, the better. And I think like we're pushing to go both towards, like, decentralizing. I think we are always aiming for decentralization and progressive decentralization. And at least internally, we're aiming for more flexibility about like, what is the minimum gift size set to, and what is the frequency, and what is the percentage of the total balance that we're giving away, in order to start to do more optimization of like leveling the playing field for everybody and making it feel really good for everybody, even if you only raised $1 versus if you raised $1 million, because like the person who raised $1 million, like raised $1 million, like they're already stoked. They don't care about the 1K match, right? But like the org that raised $1 on endowment that gets $500 in matching because like it happened on endowment, they're going to be much more vocal. And that's really that outcome that we're driving for.
Awesome. We are at time. Again, this is one of those conversations that could keep going and keep going, but hey,
you and me
appreciate it, sir.
My pleasure. Thanks, Mike. And Sam, over to you, I guess.
Taking it over to Sam. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robbie and Mike. That was a great chat. Just quick introduction. I'm Sam, Ecosystem Growth Lead at DAOstar. I'm going to be emceeing the next couple talks. So let's keep things moving on with Michelle with a presentation about the Octant Accelerator. And just a quick reminder to please drop your questions for Michelle in the chat. Take it away, Michelle.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Sam. Just trying to figure out. I know I've been on the back end sharing my screen, but I'm just give me a second to share it. All right, cool. Well, hi, everyone. And thank you so much for all of your great insights. It's been really cool to hear from everyone. And I'm so glad to see that, this summit just coming to life has been really, really cool. Today, I'm going to be talking about our Octant Accelerator that we ran last year and a little bit more about how cohort-based programming with a streaming QF flavor can work and sort of how we did it. So a little bit about me. I had marketing at Octant, and I'm also on the Polygon Community Treasury Board. Have also been part of a bunch of what has come out if you've been following Metagov in a Grant Innovation Lab. I did the initial State of Web3 Grants report in 2023 and in 2024 with Eugene, and have also published a bunch of other grants reports and case studies and whatnot. And I just sort of I'm a little bit of a grants nerd in that aspect. Before that was part of a few different grants councils. I've mentioned a few here and had been DAOing in this space before. And before that, I used to be a Web2 founder, sort of got into crypto, but like way back, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So let's start a little bit about Octant. So we fund impactful projects through epochs, and How we do that is through staked ETH returns that go to funding these. To date, we have given out over $10 million in just 2 years, over 9 funding rounds. And the way the current model works is there's a 90-day funding period where the community can log GLM and allocate ETH rewards. And we match using QF, so quadratic funding. And I'd say like with the current version, we've been able to iterate on different funding rounds and different themes and just kind of getting more specific on figuring out, one, how to give out funding more effectively, how to get the community more engaged, and how do we just get better at decision making. And with what we're building next is really making it easier for ecosystems to earn sustainably and put capital to work. There's a lot of cool things on the capital allocation side and the accumulation side. And we're using a lot of these learnings, including what I'm going to go into with the accelerator and the epoch. So in 2 years, there's just been a lot of funding we've given out. We've quietly been doing a lot of the work. If you've interacted with any part of Ethereum, we likely have funded it. And so part of that has also been investing into research and builder support. So a big takeaway from our research and work has been, and a problem that we really kept coming across was that builders need more support layers and not just financial support. Project sustainability, again, I think a lot of program allocators right now, and sort of like what we've noticed even in the past couple of sessions that really have been tackling this, is the sustainability side and a lot of the support layers. But we've been thinking about that since the first couple of epochs that we had, because we realized that there's so much more that builders need in their journey to feel supported and to really position them for success. And again, different support layers and structures for different categories of builders too. So we really were trying to solve this from an earnestness around wanting products to survive, thrive, and grow. And so last year we decided to take the first step in really attempting to tackle this problem. And it really was because we realized, like, again, we give out a ton of funding, but so do a lot of other ecosystems, and relying solely on grants funding is unsustainable. The path to sustainability is unclear for a lot of builders because there's a lot of different knowledge gaps, and there's a difference between understanding what to do and then actually doing it. And with how quickly the ecosystem grows and evolves, like there's just a lot of times just that lack of understanding, and it's just different when there's a different structured program and setting that you can be a part of. And so that was some of the initial thought process that went into why we wanted to build this program. And so our vision was pretty simple. Like, again, if you're going to be in this space, lack of resources and expertise should not be a reason for failing, right? So to bring builders access to information and to experts who've done it, and really just bridging that gap in the best way that we could. And then again, like, to bring a culture of growth and experimentation to help build on that trajectory in a time-boxed way, because we wanted to experiment with a few different modes, and it felt like 4 weeks was a really good approach for doing that. And then a cohort-based approach, because there's a lot of research and learning just around how cohort-based approaches work really well. Self-paced programs, again, they have a horrible dropout rate, but if you do have a cohort, and if you do have a smaller cohort in particular, it can work really well, and it can be really effective in being able to get results. And so that was one of our initial reasons for going and following that format. And so the way that we did it was we announced a program and shared our intent to tackle the problem. Like, just, again, it was pretty clear in terms of like what we were trying to do. It was the first time we had run a program of this sort. And so, again, this was going to be a learning experience for us as much as it was for a lot of the applicants in the cohort. But a few, I'd say, like filtering requirements that we had was, one, we wanted applicants that had received at least 1 to 2 grants. And we were ecosystem agnostic in that, Ethereum being in the Ethereum ecosystem generally being like one of the bigger requirements. But overall, the reason for having that is because we wanted to help solve for folks who had already had funding, and to understand what kind of challenges builders who had received a few grants were experiencing and how to solve for those. And so to filter for sophistication as the first part, and I mean sophistication in the grants process, because in order to be able, if you've received even 1 grant from any ecosystem, you've likely gone through a grants process. You likely have a good understanding of what you've been trying to get funding for, and have passed certain qualifiers to be able to get to that stage. And so that already puts you at a more advanced level versus those who've never received a grant or still at that earlier stage. And there are a lot of different programs that can tackle builders on the earlier stage, but this was really for folks who had had at least a few grants that they had received. The second thing we were looking for was proof of work and evidence. One challenge that who can sometimes receive funding and then may not be able to execute as well. And so again, there's a lot of different ways to solve for that, but we wanted to see more around proof of work and folks who had at a minimum level some form of an MVP or a minimum viable product, essentially to be able to showcase. And the whole reason for that was because this program was positioned to focus on revenue and to focus on financial sustainability. And if you were working on a project that was going to take a little bit too long to launch, you wouldn't be a good fit for the program. So we did want to work with teams who were going to get closer to launching and would be able to execute and really just showcase a lot of their work in the 4 weeks program. And the final part, really just making sure that they had a good plan or some form of a plan for what they wanted to do next and for how they wanted to grow, because that would mean that they were thinking about certain aspects. It didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be part of the thought process in terms of what we were thinking about. And so the most important part about it was that we did not position any financial aspect to the program. The whole positioning and the messaging and comms around it were focused on seriousness and a commitment to work and to show up. So this was going to be an intense 4 weeks, and we wanted products who were willing to put in the work to grow. And that was the main focal point, even though we were planning a financial aspect, but we wanted to make sure that funding was not why programs were going to apply and be a part of it. And that was the main motivator. So even in the interview process, so we first had a filtering process, and then in the interview process, we were able to understand some of the motivations and to understand what each builder was sort of envisioning for what they wanted to learn. We picked 15 projects and 14 of them graduated, and these were the projects that were a part of our cohort. And it was a pretty cool mix because we wanted a lot of differences in terms of there were a lot of synergies even in different projects working together. And so it was cool to even see the cohort go along and exchange and learn and push each other, because they all had different strengths and I'd say gaps that they could grow in. And so the way we structured the program was so that you would learn and then apply the learnings based after every session. So it was a mix of sessions, workshops, masterminds, and there was some structure, and then there's a little bit of chaos. So we started off the week focusing on business development and strategic partnerships and focusing more on the product side. This is because we wanted projects to think about it as the first step going in versus having it at the last stage. Again, because this was so action-packed and it was so intense, we wanted to cover the most important part first. Then we went into a week of building and engaging your community and having that be a big part of how you would then position and grow your content. And a lot of it was focused on builders who did not have big teams and could execute without having a lot of additional resources. So a lot of it was really trying to bridge that gap and making sure they felt comfortable in what they were essentially going to be executing on. The final stage of it was focused on fundraising strategies and focusing on how they could position themselves to work with other ecosystems, and that would cover the final bit of the sustainability angle. So in terms of how we kind of laid out the structure, so the way it would work is we'd have a session from, for example, founders who had raised funding and who had closed partnerships and deals, and then the projects would be working on pipelines for building their own, again, revenue pipeline and working on partnerships themselves. After a session on, for example, how to activate your community with Joke Race, they would then have to run a Joke Race contest within that week. And we had very specific expectations that we wanted to see and we wanted to see them do, because one, there was no better experience than really just being in the deep of it. And again, it wasn't about passive learning. There was a lot of focus on active learning and actually doing the thing that they, wanted to do. And so we had some really cool speakers in every single session. And then after that, they got on to even prioritizing some of the challenges that we noticed that projects were confused about was like how do you prioritize what features to bring up in terms of your roadmap? Like, how do you really get to testing? If you're getting 10 different opinions, how do you even prioritize those? And what do you pay more attention to? So that was like one part of it. The other part of it was like, how do you actually get the business side of things going, especially in a space where it feels like, you know, there's a lot of unseen rules and whatnot. And so like really getting into that. And then community being such a big part of your initial even test group, for example, that wasn't a big part to focus on, was really building that out. We then had 2 more weeks that were focused on, I'd say like the growth aspect. So how do you build your audience? How do you build your personal brand in a way that can help your project? And then on the fundraising side, it was focused on VCs who, again, we had 2 different perspectives. One was from founders who had raised capital. And then the other side was from VCs who were looking to invest into projects. And so being able to see different perspectives and different approaches, even on if projects wanted to potentially raise money and to go forward, like that was an interesting part of it. And then there was a little bit on the grant side of things. So focusing on how do you work with different ecosystems, for example, and how can you really continue forward and really build out that pipeline as you're looking to grow. Another thing we debated on, and this is something we changed halfway through the program, was we were not going to have a demo day, but because we started seeing so much of interest both in the projects and the program, we felt like it would be a really cool moment to showcase a lot of what every single builder had been doing, and it would showcase and position them in a really great way. So we had a really interesting demo day with a lot of potential partners and whatnot, and that was a really cool defining moment of the program. These were some of the other sessions, again, from builders who were really great at what they did and were able to share a lot of the behind the scenes in terms of how to grow in a very unfiltered way. And that like closed room setting helped a lot in terms of, 1, being vulnerable enough to ask questions. And then 2, I'd say like the cohort learning with different projects, giving each other feedback and being part of that process really, really helped as well. So near the end of the program, we added a funding component with the streaming Quadratic Funding round. And this was, again, our first time running an SQF round because we typically have our 90-day epochs, which are quite limiting in how they run and what we're able to do with them. And of course, that's all going to change with V2 and what we're building next. But at that point, we were quite limited in what we could do. So this was going to be a fully new component in terms of running. And so the way a traditional Quadratic funding round operates is sort of like a political campaign. You know, you've got an intense 2-week sprint where projects compete for attention, donors will make a one-time contribution, and matching funds get distributed based on snapshots of community support. And at the end of it, like once the matching is done, successful projects get big chunks of funding, but there really isn't a lot of accountability, and unsuccessful projects usually get nothing. And so sometimes it does feel a lot like a marketing contest in ways. And so not to say marketing and brand awareness don't lead to more visibility, but that definitely feels like a big factor in terms of how you can rally support. So with streaming Quadratic funding, things change a little bit. So supporters create ongoing streams that can be adjusted, paused, or redirected based on how the product is performing, and this happens in real time. The matching algorithm runs continuously, and so you can update your allocations. And so if certain projects end up doing really well and you feel a lot more generous, you can absolutely change that up. It is a longer term commitment. So our SQF round ended up running for 9 months. And if a project abandons development or again, fails to deliver or just go, like they can't really ghost you because you can literally take your funding back by stopping the stream, right? So this actually gives donors both the community amplification of QF, but it also gives individual accountability of direct investment. And, you know, you have a lot more decision-making power in that aspect. And so that was a cool thing for us to experiment with. And again, like that led to a lot of projects wanting to do a lot more to showcase more growth over time and consistently. And so we did see the projects rally the community and getting to work. We had some really cool results where in 4 weeks we saw 10 pizza parties being hosted, 12 joke race rounds. Collectively, there was over 7,000 followers and over 1,000 attestations during the program. And the cooler part, which is really the revenue side, which is over 1,000 leads that were closed. One of the projects had a mint happen and they had over 30,000 mints, over, I'd say like 800,000 in pipeline revenue. And over $350,000 in actual revenue. So these numbers are pretty cool. And again, a lot of it is because there was so much of emphasis on needing to become sustainable from a funding perspective. And our whole angling was if we can equip them and bridge that gap, they'll be able to, like, the real builders are going to be able to make the most of whatever is shared. And so a lot of builders were able to thrive in this. And it was really, really cool to see every single project really do well with that kind of support, because one part of it was focused on the experts. The other one was focused on a lot of accountability within the different groups. And that seemed to work really well. The streaming QF results were also really cool from the round. Like, we had a total, so we had 15 ETH from the Octant side that we had donated, and then we saw 15 ETH from the community. And we saw 3,788 unique donors, which was really cool, again, given the fact that this was our first SQF round. And just seeing a lot of the community participation worked really well. So to sum up, our cohort-based programming worked really well. Having sessions focused on added more accountability. Having experts who can share practical knowledge and is super valuable, and time boxing when people have to do certain aspects with. Like, a lot of times, I mean, it feels pretty simple, but nothing works better than a deadline and one that makes you accountable. So I'd say, like, that worked really well. Adding a streaming QF component really got projects to showcase and I'd say, like, get more active publicly in terms of what they were doing and to show stronger numbers. And we saw that engagement grow over time. And 15 was a good number to start with in terms of engaging, because if the cohort was too big, we realized they would not be able to get individual attention with mentors who we were connecting them with after, or even in the group sessions where they were able to ask questions and feel comfortable enough. So this felt like a really good number to start with, and it ended up working out. We only had one project drop out, but I'd say overall, like, that was, that was a pretty good experiment in what we were able to do. So to wrap up, if you'd like to chat about programs, SQF, or how to improve capital allocation and builder support, please reach out. We are consistently and constantly thinking about different programs and how to run different funding experiments, and SQF is one that we absolutely are wanting to double down on and to experiment more with. So that's all that's all in terms of my time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle, for that insight into the accelerator. That was super interesting. I think we're going to do maybe one question before moving on, since we're already almost at time. But what do you see as the most important features of a cohort? And what kind of community building did you focus on within the cohort? And how high touch was it for the Octant team?
I think building a good dynamic is important, but for that, you need to have bonding exercises in a way. So every week we would actually have sessions where we had formed mini groups as well. So one part of it was we encouraged them to connect with each other, but on the other side, we actually would, the mastermind circles worked really well, and that format worked really well, where folks were able to actually ask questions and share more about, like, what they were struggling with, and that worked really well. And I think with the dynamic as well, we try to pick a mix in terms of different geographies, different products, and we wanted to feel a synergy so that we could see a lot of learnings and growth plans, and actually a lot of exchanges there, and a lot of partnerships even within the cohort that ended up being really fruitful. So I would say, like, look out for that mix, and having a good mix of different projects helps, and having different perspectives, again, in terms of what they're really great at. So when you have, like, a media project and you have, like, an actual product focusing on users, like, there's just so much of a cool exchange that can happen there. And then different exercises where we would actually pair up different founders to, or actually encourage them to connect with each other would work. So we, at least for those 4 weeks, we were very intentional with trying to get them to work with each other. And then near midway through the program, we actually saw the results where there was a lot of stuff organically happening that we had nothing to do with, but just because they were starting to get to know each other. And there was just a lot of, I'd say, full credit to every single builder there, where they were very generous in supporting each other. And it led to a really cool effect of others trying to be more proactive in that too. And part of what we had actually shared right when we started the program was give before you take. And that is from a values perspective, helped a lot, because then there was more of an, I just think there was, like, a lot more energy in trying to give versus taking. And it was less extractive and way more generous, I would say, from every single person's perspective. And that was cool.
Amazing. Well, thank you for sharing. And I think we're going to move on quickly to the next presentation here, which is going to be Joel Miller from University of Illinois Chicago, speaking to us about fair collective decision making through plurality. Hey, Joel, the stage is yours.
Awesome. I'm seeing some little sliders light up, so I'm sure everybody can hear me, and I'll get started. So yeah, my name is Joel Miller. I'm going to tell you about thorough quadratic funding and some lessons I learned implementing it at Gitcoin. So first, a little bit about me and about this talk today. So I'm getting my PhD at the University of Illinois Chicago, where I do research in what I would call human-centered mechanism design. So this incorporates all of the math and microeconomics of normal mechanism design that we know and love, with also some more social science-oriented considerations about how human values map on to the mechanisms that we create. I worked with Gitcoin for around 2 years to implement all of this plural QF business. And what I'm about to tell you is a summary of a research paper that has been accepted to ACM EMO 2025. So ACM is the Association of Computing Machinery. EMO is equity and access in algorithms, mechanisms, and optimization. This is like a peer-reviewed academic conference. And the paper uses a combination of math and qualitative interviews. We interviewed 8 people who were round operators at Gitcoin who were not employed at Gitcoin. So we interviewed volunteer round operators to try to reduce the amount of bias that we were getting in our interview answers. We also chose to interview specifically round operators and not grantees or donors for the same reason, to try to get the least biased thoughts on these different mechanisms. I also have to thank my co-authors, of course, Glenn Wheel and Chris Canish, for helping me out writing this paper and doing this research. Okay, so what are the main takeaways that I want you to remember? Well, first off, we did a new mechanism. That's pretty much the main thing. It's a variation of quadratic funding called CoQF, or connection-oriented quadratic funding. If you're a part of the Gitcoin community, you might have heard this referred to by other names like COCM, cluster matching, cluster mapping, all of these things. I apologize for all the messiness with the branding. CoQF is the name in the paper, and I think it's the cleanest, best name. So that's what it's going to be forever now. And that's what it's going to be for the rest of the talk. So we think that CoQF gives you better funding outcomes compared to quadratic funding. It also is a very flexible framework that can work in a lot of different scenarios. However, it also does have a downside, which is that it's probably worse for ecosystem growth. And if there's one kind of broader level lesson that I feel like I've really learned, besides aside from all of this concrete stuff about CoQF, it's that actually I should also say before that, it's probably best in closed systems or when advertising is not a priority because of that thing of how it affects growth. And then lastly, the kind of higher level takeaway that I'd like folks to remember is that algorithms really have many dimensions, right? Like an algorithm for distributing money is actually not necessarily just an algorithm for distributing money. And I'll get to why exactly I think that's the case later on in the talk. Okay, so let me tell you a little about quadratic funding's history. So it was introduced in 2018 in a paper. In theory, it maximizes social welfare from a public good, where social welfare is just the collective benefit that we get from the good minus the money that we spent. Now, when I say in theory, I don't mean that dismissively. I'm just trying to delineate clearly the math world versus the real world. So in theory, it maximizes social welfare. Gitcoin starts using quadratic funding pretty soon after its introduction. And in Gitcoin's case, funding is broken up into rounds and each has a set subsidy pool. I'm sure that most folks here know this already, but I just want to be clear because it's going to matter on the next slide, essentially. Okay. So Gitcoin is using quadratic funding. Each round has a set subsidy pool, which has a fixed size, right? So projects are competing for this subsidy pool. And it turns out that in this case, pro-social utilities really cause problems for quadratic funding. Now, let me be clear about what I mean when I say quote unquote pro-social utilities. This is a word from the world of math and microeconomics, right? So when I say pro-social utilities, essentially all that I mean is that when people are making decisions, they're thinking about the well-being of others as well as the well-being of themselves. So somebody might not personally benefit from a certain decision being made, but if their friend benefits from it, they might be more likely to make that decision. All right, so in theory, again, quadratic funding is actually going to overshoot the optimal funding amount in the presence of these pro-social utilities. So it's not just that quadratic funding is not optimal anymore. That shouldn't be surprising, since in general, if you take any model and you add new wrinkles to it, yeah, things are going to change. What's important here is that the theory predicts that quadratic funding is going to overshoot what's optimal. And then in the context of a bounded subsidy pool, again, in theory, more overshooting is going to mean that the projects with the most pro-social utilities among their donors are going to overtake the funding from projects whose donors have less pro-social utilities towards each other. Okay, so we have in theory, essentially this prediction that projects with well-connected donor bases are going to get more money on average, and projects without those well-connected donor bases are going to get less money, right? That's really the main point here in terms of what the math predicts. And it turns out that according to our interviewees, this was essentially also what was happening in practice. And specifically, we really heard this term popularity contest come up a lot in our interviews when we asked folks to talk about quadratic funding. So 6 out of our 8 interviewees brought up the term. And specifically, they noted that this was a bad thing because popularity and quality were not necessarily correlated in this domain, right? So a common rebuttal to this idea that, quadratic funding is a popularity contest might be to say, hey, voting in general is a popularity contest. If I've got an election, of course, I want the person who gets the most votes to win. That's the person that's the most popular. It's the same thing. So what's the problem here? What our interviewees indicated is that in general, the popularity of a project and the quality of a project were actually not always correlated. And this was really where the problem came from. We see this as evidence for this theory of pro-social utilities actually, having an important impact on the actual practical way that folks were donating. So I'll share a quote from one of our interviewees who said, donors go through the list and pick out the projects they either know or are connected to, rather than doing the rational economist view of how you want people to donate, which is to really evaluate which is the best project that deserves the funding, right? So it seems to be, at least according to our interviewees, that, probably this interviewee might have been being a little bit hyperbolic. I'm sure some people do evaluate projects, right? But there's also this evidence that folks are donating based on their social ties, aka their pro-social utilities. Okay, so we introduce this new mechanism called CoQF or PluralQF, COCM, etc., as an alternative in an attempt to deal with this problem of pro-social utilities and their effect on, allocative outcomes. Okay, so what do I mean when I say plurality? Really, in this case, all I mean is that we're going to give more money to a project when its supporters don't share pro-social utilities, right? So we know that when supporters do have pro-social utilities, it creates this extra funding. So all we're trying to do here is to give a little boost to those other projects that don't have that leg up, okay? Of course, we can't see pro-social utilities. And here I'll stop and pause and say, in the kind of mathematical modeling world, a pro-social utility is a thing that exists between each pair of people. So like I as Joel, have a pro-social utility amount towards that guy. I have a different amount towards that other person over there. Of course, these are just modeling abstractions. Even if they did really exist in the real world, aka even if I really could give you a number corresponding to the amount I liked different people, which I actually would dispute in the first case, even if that was the case, good luck measuring something like that, all right? So there's no chance at ever getting to the truth, quote unquote, of how these pro-social utilities really work. But one compromise that we can take is we can have social groups as input, and we can assume that social groups and pro-social utilities are correlated. So of course, when I say social groups, I don't mean every single piece of information about a person. I mean relevant things. So in the context of Web3, you could think of the DAOs that people are a member of, the GitHub, repositories that they contribute to, things like that, right? We could assume that those groups are correlated with pro-social utilities. But at Gitcoin, we didn't even have the ability to see social groups like that. So, we have a big donor base. There are some places where people voluntarily, will talk about their social groups, like with POAPs or with, guilds, things like that. But we didn't have enough data to do that type of thing. And in general, it felt like it could start to become a privacy violation in Gitcoin's context. So instead, we made another compromise, which is to say, well, we've got all this donation information, so why don't we just try to bootstrap social groups off of donation patterns, right? So if somebody donates to Project X, we make a little social group called like Project X donors, and then we, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's CoQF. I will spare you the gory details of how it works exactly, although there is an appendix slide with the algorithms if anybody wants to really, punish themselves. I'll tell you, by the way, it's really not that complicated. It's just, it is a lot of annoying notation to look at. So I want to spare you guys. Let me tell you about how it was received at Gitcoin. So we introduced it for GG21, which was around 2 years ago or so, maybe 1.5 years ago. So it was used for GG21, GG22, and GG23. So we maintained the option for folks to use quadratic funding. We also let folks blend QF and CoQF results if they wanted something kind of in the middle. It happened to help with fraud and Sybil's a lot. I wouldn't say that this was my primary goal in designing CoQF, but it did kind of naturally help with that as well. All of our interviewees indicated that CoQF was a better tool for distributing money compared to quadratic funding. 5 out of 8 interviewees specifically indicated that CoQF gave a clearer signal of like which projects would give the most benefit to their community as a whole. Here we've got some statistics of how round operators chose to use CoQF versus QF. So this top chart shows the number of funding rounds that each mechanism was used for. The bottom chart shows the total amount of money awarded by each mechanism. And you can see that in both cases, round operators really preferred to use CoQF or a hybrid mechanism more than they chose to use QF, right? So 26 rounds used CoQF, 12 in total used QF or a hybrid. Here we've got, around 3.5 million distributed using CoQF and around 1 million distributed using QF or a hybrid. And by the way, this also didn't change very much over time, right? So if you kind of look at like, from GG21 to 22 to 23, this stayed relatively consistent. I've got another quote from one of our interviewees who said, "What we're trying to optimize for is that the right projects get the money, not the ones who look right, but the ones that are right." And that difference is a pretty big one. CoQF cuts through the noise. So it seems like, at least according to our interviewees, that CoQF is really doing something correctly in terms of weeding out noise and doing a better job at distributing money. Now, it's important to note, however, that distributing money is not the only thing that QF and CoQF are doing at Gitcoin, right? So Gitcoin is an open system where growth and community building is really important. Half of interviewees criticized CoQF's effects on that community building side of Gitcoin and of the mechanism. So I've got a quote here from another interviewee who says, one of the core points is not optimal capital allocation. It's community building, the marketing, the collaborations that emerge. There are many collaborations that would not have happened without the funding rounds. So this is really important because it shows you that, just giving away money is actually not the only thing happening with this algorithm. It's a locus for community building. And in that sense, CoQF had a negative impact because it removed the incentive to advertise, right? So a great way to get a lot of folks to donate to you is to go on to Twitter and just say, hey, come here, sign up really quick, just donate to me, don't worry about it. And CoQF was dampening those impacts because that's the kind of one of the purest examples of pro-social utilities that you can get. But also, this is a bad thing for the ecosystem as a whole, because now projects have less reach and so on and so forth. So this is a really important downside of CoQF that I want to be clear about that really needs to be acknowledged, okay? Okay, so to wrap up, what lessons did we learn here? First off, CoQF probably produces better funding outcomes, but you should really understand everything your algorithm is doing before making a change, right? Your algorithm might be doing extra stuff besides just giving away money. And so for that reason, I think CoQF might be the best in closed systems where adding new members isn't a goal. So something like, voting systems where you need badge holders to vote. And this is because of the fact that there's no need to incentivize new users. It's also because of the fact that you can probably plug in better social group information, right? So in Gitcoin's case, we ended up bootstrapping these social groups off of donation information, but there's no need to do that, right? Given the chance, you could also use other information that's germane to your specific context or to your ecosystem. And in a smaller system where folks can just manually report things and you don't have, tens of thousands of donors, that's a lot easier and could probably lead to better outcomes. There's a lot more room to tweak and improve the mechanism. It's a very flexible framework. And also, these ideas of plurality can be applied beyond quadratic funding. So yeah, I think that there's a lot more interesting stuff to be done with plural mechanism design in the future. And that is my talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joel. That was incredible. And yeah, we're at time, so we're actually just going to keep moving things along, and I'm going to pass the emceeing to Michelle for the rest of the day.
Awesome.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Joel. Sweet. So now we're going on to our next session and introducing Ben, who's from our very own Grant Innovation Lab at Metagov, and Vaughn, who is the founder and CEO of Butter. Guys, take it away.
Thanks, Michelle. And thank you, Juan, for coming on and sharing your insights, what you've learned around Butter. So maybe to get us started, can you introduce yourself and how you founded Butter and how you ended up in the grant space?
Of course. And thanks for having me. Good to be here, Ben, and good to see you again. I'm not your handle, also known as Vaughn. I'm one of the co-founders of Butter. We've been working in the governance and grant space now for the last 2 years. I think when we first got started, we still hadn't really in the space had figured out like delegate payments. And this is one of the first things that we did is run an experiment to distribute delegate payments with Aave. And we've since transformed from, I guess, like some very simple ideas about how to do treasury governance into kind of a full suite funding mechanism called conditional funding markets, which is based on the mechanism pioneered by Robin Hanson in 2000 or even before 2000 called Futarchy. So using prediction markets to make grant decisions.
Thank you. Now this sounds a lot like the market will fix it. Maybe for our listeners who might hear Futarchy for the first time, but also to maybe address the criticism that is associated with Futurkey. Like, what is Futurkey, and how does it lead to making better decisions, especially in the grant space?
Yeah, definitely. So maybe the best place to start is with the status quo. I think obviously today we've been talking about lots of different grant funding mechanisms, and really these are just collective decision-making systems. And obviously the one that most people are very familiar with is voting. So we have a group of people, they have some set of preferences distributed across the population, and we have to try and figure out what's the best use of their resources. And so we ask them to vote. And then we know that there are issues with voting, and then in crypto, or in at least in blockchain protocols or DAOs, where we have lots of people who could participate, we have no way of identifying who they are. We do use token voting, and now we use a version of that, obviously, which is delegated token voting. And I think that one of the issues that we repeatedly run into is how to combine the preferences of those delegates into treasury allocations or grant allocations that benefit, I guess, like the entire group of stakeholders that are related to the DAO or protocol. And so we're not saying here just trust the market. I think that's a really important distinction that Futurkey tries to make. When most people think about Futurkey, they think about paying for decisions or vote buying. So they think that you will take a market and people will just say, well, who's the highest bidder? That's the person who wants the decision the most, and just give them what they want. And funny enough, I think that's actually sometimes how a token vote by delegates ends up working out, because ultimately the person with the largest stake really ends up calling the shots. What we do in a Futurkey is slightly different. So what Futurkey does is it runs a prediction market, not on what the decision will be, but it runs a prediction on what the impact of the decision will be. So we have multiple markets, and what anybody in those markets is trying to do is price the impact or probability that a decision produces some impact. And once you have kind of a distribution of those probabilities, or a distribution of those values, then you can basically peer into the future, hence Futurkey, and see what each alternate decision would give you. So let's say you could allocate a grant to one of 10 projects, then and the thing you care about is revenue. Then what the market should tell you is if you allocated it to project A, B, or C, this will be the actual revenue you get from them in some, within some period of time. And so that's what Futurkey is doing. It's not trying to kind of hand the decision to the person with the most money, but more so trying to give us what we actually want, which is we want to know that we're making the right decision before we make it. And we want to make sure that everybody who's participating their incentives are aligned with producing that information, telling us what we actually want to know, which I guess it's a really hard property to ensure you have when it comes to, let's say, delegated token voting, or as we heard before with QF.
So essentially what you're saying is that when we have, so someone still needs to make the decision at the end whether they're gonna fund it or not, but what Futurkey and Butter is doing is really giving them a reason to make a certain decision, so for them to not have such a hard time making the decision or justifying it, but you essentially have data underpinning it. Do I get this right?
So I don't think that's an explicit component of Futurkey as a mechanism. Futurkey is just described in this like general sense, but there are versions of it which are called advisory markets, where you don't actually, the mechanism itself doesn't make the decision. So what you do is at the end you have some advice about what you could do. So the markets are saying, if you were to do X, Y, or Z, here's the impact, say, on revenue or something you care about, right? Let's say it's like user growth, and then a Futurkey which can be designed to implement the decision. So there's some kind of automated thing that binds you to doing whatever the Futurkey tells you. That's also doable. So in our mechanism at the moment, when you use Butter, we don't actually enforce the grant decision. So it's still something that you can decide not to do under certain circumstances. But the intention is to run these conditional funding markets with a complete automation. So you put some money in a contract, you design you spin up the conditional funding market, it gives you your predictions, and then given some I guess like outcome that is like within the bounds of what the mechanism allows, so there's not something that makes them invalid, they will also always execute and they will also send the money out. It's kind of like when you queue up a proposal and it goes into time lock. It's like, unless something bad happens, that means that you have to stop it. It will just execute and send the payments.
So, but we're obviously comparing this to like the usual functioning of a DAO, right? So you have a DAO governing a protocol, or you have a DAO governing a group of people and their decision making. Now, when we look at grants programs that have been featured even today, usually what happens is you break out a certain budget out of the overall budget of the DAO, and you administer it manually. So how would Butter work in a setting where you allocate a certain fund and you don't look at the DAO as a whole?
Yeah, so I think this works. So I would say that the mechanism, or at least Butter, is fairly flexible. So it doesn't matter whether you have the whole DAO and you're trying to compare decisions made by or grant decisions made by the entire DAO, or you've already given the funds to some other like subcommittee. Let's say it's a grants committee. The mechanism is quite flexible. So at any stage, like a grants council could say, well, for this portion of our funding, we will run them through a conditional funding market. And so it doesn't need to necessarily be compared directly to these mechanisms, but I think it's always helpful to have a comparison. So you can compare them directly to the Grants Council. So when we ran a market back in March with Optimism, and that was compared directly to the Grants Council. There was a pool of funding which was split between both. The Grants Council allocated 500,000 OP, and so did the Futarchy, and then the outcomes were comparable to a degree. And I guess that's just useful because I think they do have different goals, they have different objectives, and the incentives that guide the decisions are also different. So you should expect different outcomes, and that's actually what we saw. We saw very different outcomes from the conditional funding market versus the Grants Council.
So can you dive a bit deeper into very different outcomes, because that could be like virtually anything. So like maybe you have a couple of examples how they were different and what do you think about it?
Yeah, so if we stay on the topic of incentives, I guess the question is to think about the individual person who participates in a conditional funding market and what they are incentivized to do, and then potentially a Grants Council member. So a Grants Council member would probably be being paid, and the payments for the Grants Council may not be directly related to their performance on any individual grant. And they may not be being held to any particular standard around like what they needed to deliver, except that they need to be available, they need to maybe speak to the teams and so on. There's an entirely different set of incentives governing their relationship with the grants that they deliver. Now, if you think about the person who's participating in a Futarchy, they turn up, we call them forecasters, they turn up. Their job is to look at the existing prices that exist in the Futarchy. So let's say, for example, we had a conditional funding market that was trying to forecast Superchain TVL. So they're looking at a project and they're saying, well, if this project were to receive 100,000 OP, what do I think their TVL would be, Superchain TVL would be 3 months from now? And what's incredible about that is people are pretty good at saying, well, I think actually they can produce much more TVL or much less. And so as each forecaster looks at that future forecast and adjusts it up and down, what they're trying to do is they're trying to maximize their return. The closest they get to the end TVL, like what actually happens in the future, the more that their payments are maximized. And so there's a very different set of incentives guiding these two, like directly when they make that decision. And so you can think about the person in the Grants Council really caring about like, what do they think of the team? Do they trust the team? Are the team able to deliver? Maybe they don't necessarily care about what the TVL will be in 3 months. Maybe they care about what the TVL will be in 3 years. And so what you saw was that the Futarchy was able to produce like a fairly large amount of growth. Really, I mean, it didn't produce this with every single project it selected, but a few projects contributed a significant amount of TVL growth over the 3 months. Whereas with the Grants Council, we didn't see as much growth. And I think that was, and also with the control, so the projects that weren't selected again, we didn't see much growth. We actually saw negative growth in TVL. And so that's what I mean in terms of very different outcomes. There was like a large amount of TVL growth in the in the candidates selected by the Futarchy versus a kind of a much more limited amount of growth in the others.
So, I mean, this is very interesting, and I can see how this might work for well-known projects and well, potential grantees that are already known to the world. Now, what we heard earlier today that grants are also funding moonshots. So things or projects where we actually don't know a lot about. So whenever someone would come on and maybe forecast something or tries to forecast will this turn out, there's like this information asymmetry and kind of the nurturing aspect of it missing. So because of this incomplete information, we might actually just replicate an imperfect market. How would you respond to this criticism?
I'd say that's very valid. I think actually, so I think this is a good framing. So when we're trying to make a decision, there's almost two worlds we could be in. We could be in a world where information is useful to making the decision, like the truth about the outcome, is broadly distributed, right? So it's like lots of people have a small amount of that information. As they all come together, we kind of contribute to a better picture. This is kind of the convex world idea. And then we have this other situation where there's really only a handful of people who know, and they have really specific information, and ultimately it's just those people you need. And a good way of thinking about this is, what mechanisms do we have to aggregate information if we're in either of those situations? And what we know is that sometimes when we don't know if we're in either of those situations. So as you said, we want to have mechanisms for when we're trying to fund moonshots. We also want to have mechanisms when we're trying to fund some rote thing where we just need to keep pushing money into an ecosystem because we're trying to push a metric, and most of the inputs are known. And the answer, I think, is that prediction markets are designed to work in either context. So they actually don't really care whether you're in an expert knowledge setting or you're in a distributed knowledge setting, because ultimately they create incentives to attract either type of information holder to the market and turn them into an information seller. If you know exactly what setting you're in, and you know exactly who your experts are, so you've solved this triangulation problem, you know who they are, then actually you should really just go and offer those people a direct contract and say, come and work for me. But if you're in a world where you don't know who those people are, and you just want to attract them to the market and you want them to participate, then a prediction market can also do this job for you. So it's kind of like a good general purpose solution. And I think that's what markets are. They are very general purpose kind of information aggregation mechanisms, and they do always make sure that that person providing the information, their incentives are aligned to give you the useful information.
Interesting. We actually have a question from the audience. So how can we make sure that forecasters have the right context and alignment? So when you're saying it's a general purpose, how can we make sure that it actually is applied in the right way for the right purpose? And Eugene, who posed this question, goes on in asking, is limiting the set of forecasters to those taking a good way to do that? How would you respond to these questions?
There's a few really good posts by Robin Hanson about improving the candidates who are trading in market by kind of restricting the set. And I do think that this is a useful way of I guess trying to get yourself some more higher context information. But I think this also works it's counter to some of the principles of markets, like what makes them work well. And they work well when you have a large set of heterogeneous participants who have different risk profiles, not when you have lots of people who have the same risk profile, because what you're trying to benefit from is as much information as possible. So I think actually the way I would focus the design would be to focus on attracting people who have the best information, and not the people who have necessarily just the correct context. So what we saw with the optimism market was that the winner was someone who had, we have attestations on each of the traders, had no attestations for optimism. So they basically knew nothing about, they had no particular context about optimism, yet they were far and away the most profitable trader. So the question is, how do you find those people? And I think markets are good at finding those people. And I think that we shouldn't try and preempt them too much by trying to limit the scope of the people who can participate. But you might want to do it over time, right? You might want to get bad ideas out of the markets over time.
Thank you. Last question, and this is really just a short one. Would you use Butter to fund Butter? So if you're looking for your next grant round or VC round, I don't know where you're at in your company cycle right now. Would you just lead them to Butter and to your forecast?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think that would be really good. It's something that we've spoken about doing. I don't think that the platform is like mature enough yet to just run it, because it requires like still requires lots of manual handholding, which would mean that we're kind of it looks like a bit rigged, because we're also doing lots of manual stuff as well. So I don't think we could be a good candidate in the market. But yeah, I mean, we should be running them to do all kinds of dog fooding for ourselves. So yeah, and I think some other teams are actually doing that. They are like directly dog fooding, but maybe in the future.
Sounds like a lot of butter. Thank you very much.
Cheers, man.
And with this, I think I'll hand it right over. There you are, Michelle. I'll hand it back to you. And yeah.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, that was a really, really great session. Now I'll hand it over to JB, who's going to be talking about the do's and don'ts of AI. He's the founder of Tenfold. JB, take it away. State's yours.
Great. I am just getting the screen share set up. All right, I'm going to download my slides real quick because it's not being that cooperative, but I can give my intro as I do that. Keep things moving. I'm JB. I've been in crypto and AI machine learning for a while. I actually got into crypto through machine learning because I graduated into the last deep learning boom and needed a way to afford compute. And so a friend showed me the Ethereum white paper, and I used it to fund my compute, the mining. Let me see. You can help. Yeah, could you screen share from your side, Josh?
One second. Let me just get that over for you. Sorry about that, folks. Just give us.
Yes, sorry about that. So yeah, we ran in. Oh, can I add? Let's see.
All right, let me share screen. 1 second.
Cool. Thank you so much. Okay. So as I was saying, I'm JB. I've been between AI and crypto for a while, and also building big developer communities and hackathons. And let's see. Yes, thank you. I'll just say slide for whoever is doing that so kindly, as I need to switch. So the problems we're facing with grant allocation that we're trying to address with AI, some of them are in the Metagov report, such as accountability for builders, as well as being able to give them real-time personalized support. And then I think something we're all finding in 2025 is that we need to find ways to choose and incubate the best talent. There are only about 25,000 monthly developers in crypto right now. And that's too low, given anyone can kind of vibe code a solution now. So trying to make it easier for the best talent to engage with grants applications and be supported is really important. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the steps of our program, we decided to make it headless. So what that means is that we deployed an agent to both Twitter and Farcaster. The rationale for doing that was that we wanted to make it easier for people to engage, and we were also in the middle of the AI crypto bot meta when we decided to do the program. And so we were curious about whether a grant agent could go viral. And so grantees or prospective grantees would apply on Twitter and Farcaster. And then the AI would evaluate the application given a rubric from the protocol we were working with. And it would reply to applicants in real time with the evaluation. And then along with living on Twitter and Farcaster, the source of truth for the evaluation is transparent and public on a website, along with a leaderboard around how applicants ranked against each other. So we both had the ability for people to vouch for projects to the bot as the applications were rolling, and were able to have like really prestigious VCs and delegates from ecosystems and other relevant parties vouch for projects to increase the trust in it. And then we did a formal community review because we wanted basically to have everyone be able to check the AI results. Like a lot of the structuring of this program was seeing how far we could push the AI versus how much we need human intervention. And we'll talk about that in the later part of the talk. And then things like KYB, KYC payments are all done by humans just to keep the program in compliance. And also because this was very specifically like geared at, can AI evaluate projects better and or faster than grant committees? Or can it just serve as a way to like superpower grant committees so they can do more applications? Versus there were other AI projects that were like, can you rob this spot of its crypto? And that was not our project. So we had some human intervention. And then for milestones, we're in this process right now. And the AI is both checking it and humans are double checking it. And then, as I said, the payments will be distributed. And so that's basically the form factor of the program. And so now I'm going to share like challenges we faced, how we met those challenges, and then kind of wins. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Yes, perfect. So one thing we realized early is that there's this problem around AI sycophancy. And that problem is basically defined as AI is aligned and trained to believe the prompter. And when that prompter becomes a grant applicant, and that grant applicant is exaggerating what they're doing or blatantly trying to engage in fraud, it can convince an AI just on its own that that's true. And so we were seeing this with the models we launched with at the time, which was Gemini 1.5, where it was ranking projects highly because the applicant itself was talking highly about the project and not because the project was inherently good. So we fixed that later, and we can tell you how, but that's definitely one thing to look out for when you're using and evaluating these tools, is that they aren't inherently multiplayer and they aren't inherently very opinionated. They kind of, their natural state is to want to mirror the person talking to them. So you have to do a lot of work to make sure they kind of stay on guardrails around, no, you're actually like a grant committee. You're not like this person's best friend. Can I have the next slide, please? And then another problem we faced is using too much AI and crypto magic at the same time can lead to unstable systems. And so I'm just kind of citing a screenwriting book here, actually, where it talks about whenever you use like more than one type of magic system in your writing, usually that just gets too complicated. And that's how I and you can remember that building in crypto is already really cutting edge. And so when you're adding AI to that, that's also cutting edge, and your systems will be less resilient than you think. So being very careful in evaluating the tools you're using and understanding how much technical risk you're taking on when you use these tools. Because we were having like a lot of issues with kind of the headlessness, which is like the next slide, please. headlessness is kind of terrible, where it's like, okay, we want to be on Twitter and Farcaster to get maximum distribution for grantees and the program. But when you do that, you're now dealing with the fact that even Twitter isn't that stable an ecosystem anymore. And you're having to deal with like a lot of technical problems while at the same time trying to use cutting edge AI. So I think kind of the lesson here was that when you're experimenting with an AI thing, try to control your other variables. Next one. Thank you. Oh, wait, perfect. Just this graph is great. So getting into the metrics. This graph is basically showing that like our highest percentage of metrics was we got 305 spam applications. And so our next graph will show that a breakdown without the spam. But because we did this headless on socials, we got a lot of people thinking it was an airdrop potentially, and a lot of spam we had to weed out, which is another AI thing where it's like, if you're doing a headless thing and expect a lot of traffic to your AI, you need ways to keep compute costs down such that you're filtering out applications that could be using all of your compute because compute is expensive. Can I have the next slide, please? Great. And then so this one is the breakdown without spam. And so what we were able to do that I think is really cool is when we upgraded the models and did some other stuff I'll talk about in a minute, we were able to find kind of fraudulent applications, but also recover applications that we would have overlooked as humans. And then next, yes, perfect. And then we also, as I said, like the tech was super unstable. So part of this iteration was also, we had to rebuild a lot of the AI tech from scratch that we were using from an open source library. And that was an extra challenge. Next slide, please. And then we also added observability. We use Raindrop, but if you're gonna run an AI grant program or any AI thing, I think observability is super underrated for, in our case, grantee success, where it's like if a grantee is having a hard time with the AI, being able to see that and jump in as a human and give them a good experience is really important. And then having that data to improve your AI is really important. So you need some sort of observability and evaluations. Great. Let me see. Okay. So we were able to get the model in a good place as far as like catching fraud and meeting human evaluation bars and finding great candidates that we missed using a model that came out while we were doing the program called O3, and then combining that with knowledge and claims graphs. And if you go to the next slide, you can go to see an example of this where the difference between our first model, Gemini 1.5, was basically taking applications and assuming that what the applicant was saying was true and not really doing much research. But our second iteration was constructing a graph of claims based on what the user claimed. And so it was able to look at their GitHubs and look at the market they were talking about and do a ton of research and say, like, how much do I believe this? Show the user, the grantee, how much they believe this and let the user iterate, and then give them real-time feedback. Okay. So yes, as I said, we are able to detect impossible technical claims, overstated claims for a code base. In one case, we were able to detect someone wash trading their project to try to give it good metrics. The AI was able to flag that for us. And then exaggerated credentials. And then the next one is basically the confusion matrix around being able to catch all of this fraud that we found in the program. And then the next slide kind of if we go into the next slide after this one too, I think like the thing we learned around this program is we got the AI to a good place where it could evaluate applications really well. But when you're doing an AI program, especially in the open, you have a lot of people who try to game it. And so what we've been working on now is more being able to see builders in your ecosystem and like adjacent communities and what they're building like all over the world, all over GitHub, the internet, and being able to preemptively find and fund those people, I think is a better use of AI, just because it can be working all the time trying to find those people for them. And it's like a great experience for someone given the problem around like getting great talent to help us, and then also supporting the great talent we already have in crypto, just to preemptively as an ecosystem be able to help them is huge. So we're thinking a lot about that. And it seems like we're running lowish on time, so I'm happy to do Q&A now or go into anything else. Thank you.
Cool, thank you. That was great. And we have just thank you for the explanation and data. Let me see if there's any other questions as well. Cool, I think we're at time. So thank you so much. That was a really, really great session. And now I'm going to invite our next two speakers on board. So thank you, JB, for that. We've got Themes and Kush, who are going to be talking about essentially filling the gap in funding in Latin America. So with that, please take it away and I'll go backstage.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
1 second.
Yep, seems we can.
What is technology if it doesn't fail? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, I think Themes dropped. We'll just wait a few minutes to get it back up.
Okay, I am connected. How are you? Sorry about that, everybody.
Very good. Cooking.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Awesome. So I actually just wanted to start and provide if you could provide an introduction for yourself. This is Kush, the founder of Odyssey. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about Odyssey Labs and about the problem you're solving and your approach.
Nice. Yes. I'd love to be able to share my screen really quickly, just to be able to run through that. But good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody that is joining us. Super happy to be here with you all. So very, very briefly, Odyssey, we are what we call an innovation lab whose mission is to accelerate frontier tech in Latin America. We focus on what we believe to be the two most important technologies over the course of the coming decades, which is cryptography and AI. And our motto is LATAMAC, right? Very inspired by kind of the EAC thesis. So why Latin America? I'm not going to dive into specifically, all of these different details, but essentially crypto and AI have a really important role to play here in the region, and already have been over the course of the last few years. That's not so much the emphasis of this, but rather to focus on programs. And then the last thing that I'll share here is our model. We essentially really pride ourselves in being a research-driven firm. So everything we do is empowered, and really we think very deeply about the role of data in informing the rest of our programs, whether that's technical education programs, building up products, running acceleration and incubation programs, working with leading global teams that want to engage with the region, mobilizing capital and resources into the region, and also building this culture of innovation and technological optimism in the region. So that's essentially us, my background. I have done a myriad of different sort of engagements, of which Odyssey is sort of a collection of. So I previously was a researcher at Oxford and worked in the venture space, worked in the creative art space, have done a lot of consulting with sort of leading global teams looking to engage with the region as well. Odyssey started 4 years ago, where we noticed this massive gap in how do we, let's go Latam, shout out to Nicolas. So we really started thinking about the role of how do we accelerate sort of the region and bring forth social and economic abundance. To date, we've worked with the likes of Coinbase, we work very closely with Plume, Galaxy, Anchorage, Centrifuge, Mantle, and a whole host of other, Eric Schmidt, the Ethereum Foundation, a whole host of other leaders in this frontier tech space. So super happy to be here with you, Feems. Feems is a close friend and who's actually visited me in Ecuador, where I am currently right now. So that's the TLDR overview.
And you've actually come a really long way from the 2 years, I think, when you were first talking about Odyssey Labs. It's really, really great to see you grow. So I've seen that you've done many programs. And so I would actually kind of love to hear about what your early results are or signals, whether qualitative or quantitative, and what would make them a signal for it to be on track.
Yes. And I think, part of the interesting conversation here and why I'm excited to be joining this particular summit is one of the key insights that we had. I was previously one of the co-founders of Ethereum Guatemala, which was this local Ethereum community that was essentially aiming to drive a lot of grassroots adoption and educate people on the value of Ethereum. And what I started observing is it was really hard to build this sustainable flywheel to engage global players in the region through this very kind of grassroots approach, right? And so we started building out all these different programs. So just things that we have done to date that have demonstrated traction. So we published the most robust report on the state of frontier tech on the region, which has we've been able to garner a lot of engagement and partnerships. I think partnerships are super important beyond crypto as well to be able to drive validity and excitement for the work that we're doing here. We need to get out of this echo chamber. And the closest way of doing that, we're doing some research right now, for example, with the EF on the intersection of AI risks in Latin America and the role of cryptography in addressing those AI risks. And we're onboarding, all these frontier tech investors that may not necessarily have so much exposure into the space. So that's one angle specifically on the research front that has been really exciting. On the educational front, we've now had the pleasure of working with, we did a cohort of our 50 developers that we were able to transition from Web 2 to Web 3. These people are now getting jobs at leading protocols. They're starting startups, which is really, really exciting. On the sort of acceleration incubation front, we had the opportunity to incubate 40 teams through the Base Batches program. And again, some of these founders are now going on to raise substantial amounts of capital, which again, previously, I think Base Batches was actually a really interesting program in that it allocated $1 million in funding to builders in the Base ecosystem. And so to be able to work really hands-on, and the premise of that program was you go from hackathon to then an incubation program, to then you get presented at demo day in front of a whole host of leading investors. Right now, we just launched this RWA initiative, and there the caliber of founders as well has been really exciting. So most of these founders have raised on the order of millions of dollars too. So we are going to publish all the data today, but over 100 applicants to that program. And on the consulting piece, we've the impact I think is just unfolding. We're running some campaigns right now with Uniswap, for example, as they're looking to engage deeper with the region. And those are the kinds of things that are for us to be able to bring all of Latin American finance on chain and to be able to leverage a lot of these DeFi protocols is also really exciting. So the impact is just it's the kind of thing where you plant a seed and we're just kind of observing it. And as you said, sort of these things grow exponentially, essentially.
And what would you say hasn't worked, actually? What are some of the obstacles that you've kind of faced in helping these founders in the programs that you've run?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. I think oftentimes what doesn't work when you're running these sort of incubation, acceleration programs and generally trying to build bridges, essentially, which is what I think, again, I feel that sometimes grants exist in this very isolated world where people are very granularly focused on, okay, we're just going to throw money at the problem and we're not going to ask any important questions, right? So I think what hasn't worked so far is oftentimes aligning different stakeholders on the objectives of different grants programs is something that I oftentimes, I think it's the type of thing that needs a lot more attention to. If you've got, 10 different folks, each of whom is allocating energy towards certain programs, making sure that everybody's getting out of this what they want. Oftentimes, I think in this industry as well, there's a lot of vanity metrics that people are optimizing for when they give out grants. And I think that, it's just a matter of, are we trying to really bring people on chain? Are we really trying to give people access to these self-sovereign tools, or are we just optimizing for vanity metrics? So not aligning metrics at the start, I think, is another kind of key gap that we've perhaps observed that hasn't totally materialized. And then lastly, as well, is with the founders as we run these different programs, is how do we ensure that founders, from the moment that they engage with anything that we're able to do, we have really clear expectations of, over the course of these different programs that we run, what do you want to achieve, and what do we want you to achieve as well, right? And so ensuring that there's this very strong alignment in like the individual's objectives, and then our objectives and our partners' objectives, and being able to track those. And now the great thing with AI is like tracking and measurement is actually many orders of magnitude easier. And so I'd say that's how we try to mitigate and overcome some of the challenges that we've previously faced.
And so you mentioned grants, and I know that you also run an incubator as well. And so what do you think for founders right now are really the best mechanisms for growth? And at what stages do you think that those particular mechanisms are best suited for them?
Yes. So with regards to engaging like promising founders on the grant side, I feel that I think it depends on the grant. It's hard to fully generalize, to be honest, because sometimes I feel like some grants come with a lot of strings attached. It's like, hey, you can only do this thing on like our specific thing because you're getting money from our thing. And sometimes those grants can be really beneficial. Sometimes they can actually be quite detrimental, right? And I'm generally not a fan of like, specifically, I guess in the Ethereum ecosystem, I always feel like the goal is to be able to scale and grow Ethereum as a whole, rather than like any one niche ecosystem, right? And like scale the EVM and ensure that, as many people come on chain. And so, I feel like from particularly for this audience, right, is let's ensure that like Ethereum is the North Star, and, the EVM and generally blockchains, right? Like I think bringing more people on chain is generally a net good for the world. And so optimizing for that, and that being kind of the primordial objective, is the starting point. From that, I think specifically to your question, like, I think it really depends on what founders are looking for. Some founders are very happy to get engaged and deeply wed to a specific ecosystem. Other founders, I think, are looking for much more optionality and are looking for other funding mechanisms and vehicles. I think grants can be really helpful by way of like kickstarting founders, but I think it's why I love these more engaged programs that are much more, I think, beneficial than, hey, here's this money, good luck. It's more so, hey, here's this money, here's this set of like mentors, here's the tracking, here are the metrics, and so on, that I always feel will leave everybody in a more optimal situation.
And let's talking about like funding and impact. What have you seen are the types of metrics that actually work best? And at what situations do you think that we should be measuring them at?
Yes. There's three, I always think about this in three like key components of what builders generally should be like thinking about. So the first one is product, right? So what is the thing that you're actually putting out into the world, right? And how do we help you like measure and track that? And measuring and tracking product essentially looks like your smart contracts, your front end. Maybe it's if you're producing research, then it's like the actual content behind the research and so forth, right? And setting a goal, right? Let's say as we design programs and it's an 8-week-long program, we break it down week by week across these 2 different categories that I'm going to run through. And I say, okay, week 1, we're going to achieve this. Week 2, again, I always really encourage people to like lean very heavily into AI as a core way for you to track, the conversations. Like the really cool thing about this industry is so much of this is digital. So it actually makes it super easy for us to be able to like track and measure everything that we're doing, right? And so, on the product side, those are a few different categories that I always encourage people to observe, right? And those are quite objective too, which is great. Then the second pillar that we always really focus on is distribution, right? And so on the distribution front is, who's using the product, and how many people, and what do they say, and what does that ultimately mean for the way? And it's this sort of iterative cycle between the product and the distribution side. But I think on the distribution angle, what I think is really exciting and impactful is, how do you create these really rapid feedback loops that enable you to just like, okay, maybe you put your product out into the world and you get some feedback, and then you come back to the product, and then it's these sort of ever expanding circles that eventually end up reaching people becoming massively successful to building these products that people love and use on a regular basis, right? So what do we measure there? We measure, the number of community members that are actively engaged with what you're building. We measure the number of views and content sort of engagement that you get as people are shipping this out into the world. And then the other third component is how many actual users do you have on the platform as well, right? And I think that's the other super essential piece. And thirdly is sort of the finance side of the house, or funding is generally what we call it. And this is, by the way, isn't just like, hey, am I getting grants? Am I getting investment? No, what is the financial sort of economic viability of the product that you're building, right? And so, this is how much revenue have you been generating, right? It's cool. So over the course of, the duration of my sprint, I'm going to generate this amount of capital, right, by way of revenue, which I think is something that's really important. Ensuring that we have these self-sustaining initiatives, I think, is always critical. And then we use a lot of those metrics to then reverse engineer a little bit of what other funding mechanisms should be available for you, right? And so, whether that's grants or whether it's fundraising, right? And so let's make sure that, across, again, it's product distribution and funding, how are we ensuring that you as a builder, whatever, you're a founder or a researcher or whatever, the really cool thing about this framework is it just applies across these different kind of vehicles. And that is, hey, maybe I need to go fundraise. Maybe I need to go raise, an equity round, or I just need some capital to keep the lights on for a few more months until we're able to build this massively successful thing. So those are a few things, just categorically how we think about it and how we classify these different components.
So we've been talking about life cycles and also grantee life cycles, but I'm really actually curious about a founder's kind of life cycle or path. And so how do you see maybe their growth pathway or direction kind of differ from Web 2 to Web 3 perspectives? Are founders, creating a plan in the same way that they would maybe a much more traditional Web 2 product as opposed to Web 3, or is kind of the business model the same for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, I'm a bit of a cynic sometimes with Web3 founders for two different reasons. Because not that this is obviously not as a whole, because otherwise we wouldn't be working with accelerating Web3 founders, but some I think sometimes the position of a certain Web3 founder is skewed in two perspectives compared to perhaps a Web2 founder. So one is the over-reliance and over-incentivization of grants that sometimes misinterprets what product market fit really means. And so sometimes founders will end up getting a grant from a specific ecosystem and be like, oh my God, I found product market fit. No, you found somebody on a grants team that liked your idea and gave you some money. That doesn't mean that the market as a whole really wants what you're building, right? And so that is one massive, oftentimes what I really feel is a big detractor from a lot of Web3 founders is the misalignment of grants and oftentimes how that makes Web3 founders think. And then the other angle, of course, is tokens, and people and again, this is perhaps less so for philanthropic-based projects or projects without some sort of incentive to generate profits. But those that are looking to, say, launch tokens, are you optimizing for the token launch, or are you optimizing for building a real product, right? And what a lot of people don't realize is the moment that you do launch a token, that essentially becomes another sort of product in and of itself, right? And a really important one, and one that investors and the market and so forth all judge you off of as well. So I think those are probably the two key pillars that I oftentimes feel a lot of Web3 founders oftentimes have very different insight on, and perhaps aren't optimizing for the utility of the product in the market.
So that actually comes with a great follow-up question. So outside of financial support, so beyond funding, which types of support do you see the most promising?
I mean, I
for
think
Web3 founders, I guess.
Yeah. So essentially, you know, people like founders come to ecosystems for different reasons, right? So they either come for the network, right? The people that they get access to. They come for the capital. They come for the ecosystem, so sort of the network effects that exist around a different community or protocol, chain, whatever, what have you. Or they come from the technology, right? And like those four sort of different parameters, I think are oftentimes what I think we need to be really thinking deeply about. If you know, say in the audience here, if you're a chain, if you're a foundation, think about, you know, these four different verticals of like, what are you offering founders, right? There are ecosystems out there, for example, that are great on the technology, great on the capital, but offer no ecosystem support, or there's no network around that ecosystem, right? And so oftentimes that's not an optimal place for a founder to be. There are other such cases where the ecosystem and the network is great, but the technology is horrible and there's no capital. And like I could, you know, at some point I might like map out all the different, like I think funders of the space and across these sort of four criteria, to essentially talk about like where across these different verticals like founders could be optimizing for, right? So I think that's we should be across these four, and it's like a mental model I think is probably quite useful for people, is to think about, you know, are we across these four categories optimizing for all four of these, right? Because I think that's what will ultimately draw founders into different ecosystems. And by the way, just to quickly,
and you actually just answered.
Yeah. Just like one other thing to say there, like let's talk about specifically grants and like capital funding, right? Because I feel like that's a big focus of this this entire kind of stream and the summit is, you know, I think there's no oftentimes when you end up giving founders like an equity-based investment, founders are actually quite grateful for that, right? Because it means they know that you are as bought in as the founder on the project that they're building, right? Because it's not this like one-off grant where it's like, hey, here you go, see you never again. No, rather it's like, oh, I know that, you know, this particular ecosystem has a meaningful stake or, you know, somewhat of a stake in what I'm building, right? So I would encourage people to get creative as how they think about incentive alignment, right? Because that's ultimately what this entire industry is about, to ensure that we are giving people the right opportunities to be able, and founders specifically, to be able to really thrive and make the most out of their grants.
I think that that's a really good point because, you know, builders want to build and have value in an ecosystem. And so if there's a way for them to actually have that impact, then they will continue building something that's valuable. Thank you so much, Kush, for doing this little fire chat and informing us about the work of ODC Labs. Are there any like final things you'd want to say or share about the work that you're doing, and how do people find you?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Feems, for the invitation and for the entire team for putting this together. Yeah, you can find me on X, 0xKush. You can find Odyssey at Odyssey Labs on X as well. Just, you know, final remarks, perhaps. One of the really beautiful things about this industry is the velocity of capital, right? And kind of the rapid, as I was mentioning earlier, sort of capacity for us to align incentives for folks. And let's not misuse that. You know, there are, specifically, why do we work in Latin America? Because we think that, you know, cryptography and artificial intelligence has incredibly high product market fit here in the region. And ensuring that we are optimizing the use of resources, I think is mission critical to crypto success, essentially, right? And so the more use cases and utility that we can drive for end users, I think the better off we will all be. So thank you again, Feems, and looking forward to tuning in for the rest of the summit.
Thank you. Bye, folks. And on to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Feems. That was a great session. And thank you, Kush. That was also great. It's been such a cool day, just with everything that's been, like all the sessions, and just, I think all of the speakers have been so great. I feel like this is just, as a grants nerd, this probably couldn't have been a better day, just with all these learnings. And we've got quite an interesting packed schedule tomorrow as well. Looking at our numbers, I see we've had over, 2,200 of you all who've been part of the session. So All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for staying until the end. This has been really, really great. Thank you for all the attention and for staying on till the end. Again, we've got a really packed schedule tomorrow as well, starting at the same time. And we've got some really great speakers again. A lot of you have probably heard from today as well. But again, we're going to be back with new insights, new sessions, and we're going to be posting the agenda shortly after the stream ends for what's going to be happening tomorrow. We also have, just make sure to follow us on the Metagov account on Twitter. So that's where you're going to see the stream again. And if you're joining from the Octant side, we're also going to be streaming from there as well. Again, thank you so much and have a great rest of your day, evening, or afternoon, wherever you are. And we'll be back with another, our final day tomorrow at the Grant Summit.